I did not make this fanfic, support the author in the link below. Chapter 41? Scientific food? Really? In the end, Izuku didn't join the rest of the class during their movie night, opting to hide within his bedroom and finish unpacking his stuff, with only the dim hum of noise coming from the floor below, keeping him company from the anxious thought which kept fogging his mind. Classes were set to begin again tomorrow, and Izuku wasn't really too sure how to feel about it. Things were going to be different from now on. There were people now in his class who were now aware of who he was and the crimes he had committed. Izuku grimaced as he placed one of his All Might figures on his shelf. He hadn't had the chance to speak with any of them yet, and just by the looks and glares he received, he knew his stay at UA was going to become far more of a challenge to keep a smile plastered on his face for the sake of appearances. He hadn't even taken into account their reactions once they would learn that he had been excluded from heroic lessons. That night, he hadn't got that much sleep either, tossing and turning in his bed as memories haunted his dreams as he woke up every other hour. By the time his alarm had gone off in the morning, Izuku was left feeling exhausted. Izuku had let out a tiresome sigh as he had stared up at the bare ceiling of his room, contemplating whether it was worth getting out of bed yet, before rolling under the covers as he covered his head with his pillow. There was little point in getting out of bed so early. Unfortunately, his memory had failed to provide the reason his alarm had been set so early, much to Izuku's annoyance and displeasure. Only around 10 minutes later, a knock at his door rang through the wood. Aizawa had come to remind him to get out of bed and gather his school supplies before meeting him downstairs in the entryway to be escorted off to the main campus. He wasn't permitted to eat in the dorms, around with all his friends, after all. Izuku had forgotten about that. Thankfully, there had only been a few of his classmates already downstairs in the kitchen making their breakfast once he arrived, subconsciously looking at the occupancy of the room before quickly walking past them as he avoided eye contact with them. The group giving him a range of odd to distrustful looks as he scuttled past towards Aizawa. He had only seen them for a split second, but as Izuku kept his head lowered as he followed his sensei closely behind, he couldn't help but feel the odd taste they had left in his mouth as he had left. It certainly wasn't one of hunger. The odd looks he had received from Iida, Kirishima and Tokoyami, wrongly supplied from his paranoid mind, morphing into one of hesitancy and distrust which had followed him out of the building. Was it his hair? Was it because Izuku was unable to hide the white patches which taunted him in the mirror, as well as the day before? Was it the dark circles under his eye that made him appear and feel so exhausted and tired? Had someone already told him surely Kirishima hadn't found out what he was already? Was that why he was reacting to him like that? The others weren't allowed to tell anyone. Aizawa had reassured him that they had been silenced by the police, and yet the looks he had received had forced unnecessary doubt into his already paranoid and anxious mind. The questions which kept piling within his thought, weighing his emotions down, didn't help either, the looming possibilities of his other classmates finding out only growing as time seemed to pass on. He hadn't known at the time, but Kirishima's wandering concerned eyes had only been of worry for his friend. Once had arrived at school, having trained silently behind Aizawa the whole way, he was led into one of the offices where he was expected to eat. He knew it was necessary, the watchful eyes which almost scrutinized every mouthful of food from the specially prepared portions of flesh, for the sake of his fellow UA students and staff, but Izuku couldn't help but feel the everlasting shame and guilt looming in his stomach. It seemed as if even ghouls could be put off from their meals when faced with heightened anxiety and damped feelings, even if the now curated food wasn't coming straight from the slowly cooling flesh of a fellow human he had a hand in killing. As glad as he was that he had been promised his food was from people who had volunteered their bodies to science and hospital training after their deaths and were no longer needed by the hospitals they were stored in, Izuku didn't really want to question where the flesh was coming from. He didn't want to consider the possibilities that they were lying to him for his own sake of mind. If the flesh was from suicide victims, they certainly deserved a better fate than this. It certainly wasn't as good as fresh meat, as much as it disgusted him to admit it, but every so often a chunk of fresher food came to him, which Izuku could tell was only a few days if not a week only. The fresher stuff made Izuku feel metaphorically ill, no matter how delicious it was. After he had finished eating, much like during the week before, Izuku was silently allowed to leave, given the privilege to walk to his classroom alone. Aizawa had quickly waved him off as he stated that he would catch up with him soon, as Izuku had looked over at where he had been uncaringly snuggling down in his sleeping bag. Leaving him to walk past the possibly hundreds of cameras and hidden ones towards his, where he could smell his classmates' seating. Each subtle movement the cameras made a dark reminder that he was being watched as he had shuffled past, that he was never truly left alone. They had told him this was what was going to happen to him once he had arrived back at UA. He knew that there were going to be eyes on him, watching him for the safety of others around him, no matter how much they apparently trusted him. Izuku just couldn't put a finger on why each small movement the cameras made left him feeling worse and sadder by the second, his emotions making his heart feel heavier in a way it hadn't done since Ochako had accepted the monster he truly was, while feeling more empty than he had been in months. Subconsciously, Izuku had forgotten what the weight of his own heart had felt like slowly drowning within his chest. He hadn't realized till then how much just her presence in his life had benefited him in the long run, and until now, and now he had destroyed her arm and possibly ruined all the work she had put into making their friendship work through all the trials and tribulations he had caused her. He truly was a pathetic, horrible friend, no matter how much she had tried to deny it. Once he had arrived at his classroom, most of his classmates were already seated talking among themselves, leaving Izuku to silently walk in as he looked around the room, noticing only Todoroki and a few others were yet to arrive. As his eyes had wandered, Ochako offered him a small, awkward smile as he had walked through the door, which Izuku returned weakly. Not having the energy to keep his smile his brightest, while Bakugo hadn't even bothered to look up from where he was gazing out the window as he walked past to his seat. It was calm, it felt normal, but Izuku couldn't help but feel on edge from the few disgruntled and uncomfortable glances sent his way, which outweighed the oblivious chatter around them. He felt like something's prey. It hadn't taken him more than a second to notice the undoubtedly terrified vibrations coming through the floor from Minetta's direction, who was seated just behind him, the petrified boy shivering with fear as he had tried his best to hold himself together. Izuku couldn't blame him for being terrified of him, but attempting to keep his nerves subtle in his presence, whilst keeping his secret quiet from his supposedly oblivious classmates, was horribly poor. He wasn't prey, they all saw him as a predator. He wanted to feel bad, calling out his classmates' pathetic attempt to himself, but the anxiety and stress it brought him far outweighed his abilities to worry, even though he knew he would undoubtedly be feeling repercussions later. He always had a habit of putting others before himself, at least that was one of the few traits his trauma hadn't destroyed. Siro's voice cut through his thoughts as he noticed him turning back slightly to talk to the purple-haired boy behind him. "Hey Mineta? Are you alright?" Izuku flinched at the question just as Izawa-sensei had walked through the door, wrapped in yet another sleeping bag he had spotted laying around his sensei's apartment, which looked more like a yellow space suit than anything else. The sudden silence which came with his appearance was a blessing in disguise, as Izuku felt an instant wave of relief as he let himself take a deep and calming breath, leaving Siro's question cut short and Mineta still shivering silently behind him. Grimly, Izuku realized that it was going to be far more challenging for him to be around his classmates than he initially realized, the brief incident with Mineta mentally draining him as he let his body sag down, lowering his head to rest in his hands. He wasn't even 5 minutes into his first day back at school. As Izuku was slowly calming down from the relief he felt from his sensei walking into the classroom, the pro hero took a moment to scan his eyes across the classroom at his pupils, noticing the tension which seemed to linger around the few of them who had learnt about Izuku's secret. The pro hero let out a quiet sigh as his eyes combed through his students' expressions, notably recognizing Isaaca's slumped figure looking exhausted and nervous at the same time, with Mineta seated just behind him, looking as if he was about to pass out from how pale he was. Izawa narrowed his eyes slightly in thought as he realized the potential incidents which would occur from their seating arrangement, looking around for possible places to switch people. "Mineta, switch places with Uraraka. You'll be seated there from now on." The look of utter relief on both Mineta and Isaaca's faces was instantaneous as muffles of confusion rung around the classroom. The scrapping of Uraraka and Mineta's chairs could be heard, the latter quickly rushing out of his seat towards where Uraraka was getting out of her seat with a smile. Izuku, who had been watching silently, looked at Izawa with a small nod of gratitude before he turned to look as Ochako quickly bounced over to the seat behind him with a warm smile, which he slowly offered weakly back, just glad that Mineta had been moved from behind him. Izawa waited for the class to quieten down from the lower murmur at the sudden seating change, the silence coming quickly towards him. "Now you have all settled down, it's time for me to tell you about your next big battle." Izawa watched as some of his students shifted at his foreboding words as he narrowed his eyes seriously, bringing them all into the convocation. With the events of your summer camp and the attack on the USJ, along with your internships, you all now have seen what it is like to face villains in real-life situations. You've seen the power some of these villains you may face in the future possess and the hurdles you must overcome to defeat them. Out of the corner of Izuku's eyes, he could feel people watching him at Izawa's words, leaving him feeling dejected and ashamed as his sensei continued talking. These events will give you the upper hand when it comes to integrating yourself into the hero industry, but that isn't an excuse to slack off now. Your opponents won't start slacking off now, and the villains you face certainly won't care. A few students nodded around the room with understanding, their own flames of determination flickering around the room, whilst Izawa gave them a moment to take in his words as he turned with the controller in his hand towards the board and flicked on the screen. A small chart came onto the holographic board stating the few words super moves. The League of Villains have gone into hiding for now, but I can assure you all that doesn't mean they won't be back. Use these next few months to increase your strength and continue with the training you started during your summer camp. Izawa paused momentarily as he lowered his head into his scarf, his determined tone replacing itself with his usually tired one. In a month's time the next provisional licensing exams will be coming up, Izawa began, turning back to look at the board as he flicked over a slide to the next hologram. Usually, only second years and above have the chance to obtain a provisional license, however. Due to recent events the school board has asked Nezu to extend it to first years. This license will be your first step to becoming true heroes. The wave of excitement that fluttered around the classroom was instantaneous, Izuku looking around the room as smiles replaced the determined looks almost each of them had shared. Their own spirit momentarily lifting Izuku's own before he remembered Izawa's words from one of these few nights a week ago. He wasn't allowed to join in with heroic lessons, which meant there was no way for him to develop any super moves for the licensing exam. Was he even going to be allowed to participate in the exam anyway? As his thoughts buzzed through his head, blocking out the cheers and excitement from around the room, his sensei cleared his throat as he waited for his class to return to silence again, which they promptly did. Izawa had let the serious tone in his voice drop, and he let out a sigh. I know the last few weeks have been tough on all of you, but I'm glad that at least, the majority of you are still here. An awkward silence rang around the room as eyes flicked over to the singular empty seat, a look of resignation shared around the room as the majority of the students thought back to the cover story they had been told of Hagakure's absences for UA to save face. You have your first heroic lesson this afternoon. I want all of you to put in some thought of any possible super moves you can come up with before your class. Izawa began again, looking around the room after a while, moving on from the somber atmosphere his words had created. I want you all to put in your best efforts. Class dismissed. As his sensei had finished talking, the sudden sound of scuffling feet and scraping chairs cut through Izuku's lost thoughts, causing him to jump back to the present suddenly as he let out a confused, startled sound. Ichako, who had been picking up her bag, looked over to Midoriya at the sound, quickly noticed his lack of awareness as she walked past his desk while he sat looking around the room in confusion. She tilted her head in puzzlement at his odd behavior. Deku? Are you okay? Izuku looked up at his friend in surprise as she had looked down at him, not realizing when she had appeared by his side with her eyebrows furrowed in his direction. Deku? Oh, Midoriya? Unexpectedly, Izawa's voice cut across the classroom just as Ichako was about to repeat her question, causing them both to jump slightly in surprise. Yes. Izuku stuttered out dumbly, realizing he had been caught up too much in his own thoughts to register what Izawa had been saying. His sensei's eyes relaxed slightly at his flustered response. Could I have a word with you for a moment? The two students shared a quick look between themselves, Ichako quickly looking over to her sensei walking towards them before leaning back down to whisper something to her friend. I'll wait for you outside the door? Okay? She uttered quickly to Izuku with a small comforting smile before jogging to the door with the rest of their classmates before Izuku responded. Izawa turned his head to watch as Uraraka walked out the door before walking to lean against Bakugu's desk as he spoke. I wasn't sure if you had remembered, considering everything that's been going on, but Nezu asked me to remind you that he would like to see you in his office instead of your heroic lessons. Izawa conveyed softly, his quiet voice somewhat comforting to the green-haired boy as his sensei avoided drawing the attention of the few lingering students leaving the room. Thankfully, most of the other students weren't paying much attention as he spoke, leaving Izuku sighing grimly before replying with a sad smile as he also stood to leave the room. Right. Thank you for reminding me, sensei. Izawa nodded slowly, slightly concerned as he watched his student's demeanor before calling out Midoriya's name. Midoriya. His voice called out calmly, causing the green-haired boy to pause in his step. MHH? Izuku tilted his head lightly in confusion, waiting for his sensei to continue. His sensei furrowed his eyebrows in thought, hesitating before speaking up. I know this is going to be difficult, but the responsibility I gave myself while looking after you at the staff apartments doesn't stop now you're living in the dorms. You're always welcome to speak to me if something, or someone, is bothering you. Izawa had finished with a pause, his sentence almost seeming as if he had more to say, but didn't know how to express it in words. Izuku's expression loosened slightly as he looked at his sensei with surprise, the latter giving him a small, odd yet somehow comforting smile. Izuku kept quiet for a moment, not really sure of what to say, as he felt an uncomfortable lump form in his throat from being put on the spot so suddenly, resorting to giving his sensei a grateful nod as he turned to leave the room again. Thank you, sensei. He walked out of the room in silence, closing the door behind him as Izawa stood in the middle of his classroom, letting out a deep worried breath. He couldn't help feel the few flakes of guilt floating through him as he took in the dejected look Izuku had left with, even though there was little Izawa could do to work around the rules and restrictions placed above him. In all honesty, there wasn't much Izawa could do to avoid a lot of the things that he knew would happen between Midoriya and the students who knew of his powers. It was plainly obvious of the rift slowly starting to form, but he knew it wasn't his place to tell them all what had happened to Midoriya, that was up to him to decide. Izawa's eyes paused as he watched down the corridor behind his students at the confused and concerned looks both Uraraka and Todoroki were giving their friend as they walked out the door together towards their first lesson. Well, at least Midoriya wasn't entirely alone. As the weeks drew close to the licensing exam his classmates and friend were preparing for, Izuku couldn't help but feel more lonely than ever. Izawa's words had hit close to home, far more than Izuku had initially released, but as the days passed by it was plainly obvious that the mood in the classroom around him had begun to grow sour, and the tension he felt growing between him and the few who knew had become thick and palpable. It was clear to him that some of the others in his class had figured out that something had clearly happened. The weight which held him down with each glance and glare he received only grew stronger by the day. Every disappearance he made early in the morning. Every school lunchtime he was removed from. Every hero course lessons he was pulled from. They were all beginning to add up. Izuku knew he was free to tell his classmates the truth, to involve them in part of his life which had inevitably doomed his heroic dreams from the start, but each time he came close to confessing something had stopped him, a force that held him back and kept his mouth shut. For all Izuku could know, it might have been the petty side of him that felt the anger and annoyance he despised growing from within himself, fueled from the thought that none of them who had seen him at the summer camp had bothered to ask him what had happened for themselves. Sure, they must have realized that the school would never have let him back into UA if they had considered him a threat. The prospect just made Izuku's head hurt. The fear a few of his classmates felt towards him was beginning to spread, and it was clear people were starting to ask questions. Only a few days after the new school term had begun, he had walked into the kitchen only to overhear an argument raging between Todoroki and Bakugo about something which had clearly happened in one of their heroic course lessons, listening silently to the context of it all. Apparently, the conversation in the changing rooms about why he hadn't been joining in on hero course lessons had come up, and it had caused Mineta to slag him off in front of their classmates, the purple-haired boy's words apparently striking a chord with Todoroki and Bakugo. Result in the supposedly private argument in the kitchen. Are you seriously going to let Mineta say that about Midoriya and get away with it? Bakugo. I thought you were his friend. I never said he was my friend, idiot. I was just trying to get the attention off him. That's not the point. Mineta saying things about how it would be better if Midoriya wasn't there is bound to bring questions and attention to him that he doesn't need to deal with at the moment. We can't let Midoriya hear people saying things like that to him at the moment, and we need to tell Izawa to make sure he doesn't do it again. Fine. You can tell him. But if Mineta can't keep his mouth shut next time, then someone's gotta do it for him. At the time, Izuku had walked away from the argument silently and unnoticed. A few days later, Uraraka had hesitantly told him about the girls in his class, all asking about the distance, which had formed since the summer camp between him, her and Iida, leaving Uraraka at a loss of what to say. It was when she had told him that he realized the strain and tension he was putting on his own friends' relationships, and they were beginning to suffer the consequences of standing by his side. His close friends, the people who knew his secret, and the rest of the class were beginning to form new and separated friendship groups. The group of people who had seen the monster he hid within his heart, choosing their sides, leaving Izuku trapped on the far edge, with only a few unsure staggers, such as Kirishima and Momo, stuck in the middle. Slowly but surely, the close-knitted class that had once been one was slowly falling apart around him, as accusations and false rumors began to spread around Izuku, leaving him feeling more heavy-hearted than ever, with only Todoroki, Uraraka and surprisingly Bakugo standing strongly by his side. Izuku couldn't stand what he had created, he hated what he had done to his friends, and he hated himself for not telling his classmates the truth they deserved to know. The days seemed to pass by in a blur, each one merging into the next as the pattern of eating, school, and sleep continued. Soon enough 2 weeks had gone by, and nothing had improved. Alright everybody, you've got a 2-hour hero course lesson this morning, everybody grab your kits and go to the changing room. Aizawa had begun, a new day at school signaled by the ringing bell which came calling down the corridor. As Aizawa turned to talk directly to Midoriya, Nisus would like to talk to you again this period, please head to his office as usual. The looks shared around the classroom made Izuku grimace slightly at his sensei's words, the glares making him cringe as he ignored the few other odd looks he received, following the rest of his classmates out the room before heading in the opposite direction alone. It was going to take a while before he got used to the thought of not participating in the heroic lessons again. It certainly wasn't the first time he had been called up to Nisus' office during what would have been his hero lessons, but more often than not, he was made to sit in the staff room and assist the other teachers with work, much to Izuku's disappointment. Though sometimes he was given the chance to stay with All Might instead. Izuku shuffled his feet along the floor and he held his hands within his pockets, slowly walking up the stairs to Nisus' office. It was really off-putting and somewhat depressing at times, having to spend his time doing homework in the staff office with all the other teachers while his friends were off having fun, even if he knew the teachers were seemingly trying their best to make his experience somewhat exciting for him. Although there was little fun to be found in marking. With a sad sigh, he reached Nisus' office and reached up to knock on the door, only to be greeted by a little sticky note on the door. Izuku tilted his head questioningly as he reached up to pluck the small yellow note off the door before he read it. Midoriya, for our meeting I would like for you to join me in the first year's support classroom, and I'll meet you there. Nezu. Confusion settled into Izuku's expression as he slowly put the note into his pocket, curiously wondering what the principal could want with him down in the support classrooms as he trotted down the stairs. After a few flights of stairs down, past his own classroom again and into another tower of the school, Izuku reached the support classroom labeled on the note before knocking on the door and walking in as he called the principal's name. Principal Nezu. He questioned cautiously as he walked slowly into the room, looking around the student-free room, only to see the small mammal turning to face him at his name being called. Ah! Midoriya, how wonderful of you to join us. Nezu called out with a smile, his little beady eyes shining as Izuku walked over to him, where he was standing beside who Izuku identified as Power Loader. Izuku peered over their shoulders to try and see what the pair were doing, curiosity getting the better of him, just as Nezu turned to look at him, catching him in the act. Ah. Sorry. I was just wondering, Izuku stammered as he jumped back slightly in a panic, only for Nezu to laugh lightly. It's alright to be curious, Midoriya. We were just discussing something we believe could be beneficial to you. Izuku tilted his head slightly with confusion. Beneficial? He questioned, as Nezu nodded and turned back to the desk Power Loader had gone back to look at. That's correct, Nezu started joyfully, turning to Izuku with a closed-eyed smile. We are currently trying to find a way for you to be able to participate in heroic lessons again. Izuku felt his eyes startle wide at his principal's words, not daring to get his hopes up as he stared jaw-dropped at his teachers in disbelief. What? I thought I wasn't allowed to participate in heroic lessons again. Nezu turned to face him with a wide smile. That, fortunately for you, isn't the case. The mammal cheered, slowly hopping off the chair he was standing upon onto the table in front of them, Power Loader silently continuing to work as the principal and student spoke. Izuku was left stunned at a loss for words, stuttering as he tried to form a coherent sentence through all the racing questions in his mind, leaving forward instinctually as he felt a hungry urge for answers overcome him. What be but? How? Nezu turned back to the work on the table as he replied. Powerloader and I have been trying to discover a much faster and secure method of acquiring food for you, instead of having it delivered to the school from outside sources. He began, slowly lifting up one of the pieces of paper on the table for Izuku to get a better look at the work, the words laboratory food written inconspicuously to deter any prying people from discovering the project's true purpose. I'm sure you are aware that it would not be ethical, and therefore not possible, for me to find you a secure food source from within the school walls, through the means of collecting it from people here with regeneration quirks. He started again, leaving Izuku nodding silently, and he was left intrigued at the principal's words. So, I devised a plan to see if it would be possible for us to grow our own food for you in a secure and harm-free environment. Izuku felt his jaw drop once again, his mind left unbelieving and blown away at the prospect. But how? Izuku stammered out, desperation slowly leaking into his voice. Surprisingly, it was Powerloader who took over in the explanation. We plan to take microscopic samples of cells from someone who possesses regeneration quirks and utilize the powers of someone who has a quirk which allows them to stimulate the process of mitosis in the cells without the presence of oxygen and nutrients they would usually need. Nezu hummed in agreement, offering the paper to Izuku, who took it subconsciously. We are hoping the combination of the two quirks will provide successful results. Thankfully, someone in the General Studies course, who has just the quirk for mitosis stimulation, has generously agreed to help us. Under the perception that we are conducting other experiments without alerting them to their true purpose. We have been practicing with some samples already, and I thought it would be a suitable time to tell you. The tests so far have been successful, and the products have all come out in the same molecular structure of human flesh. Izuku blinked in shock, the words reaching his ears seemingly too good to be true, as Nezu gave him a comforting smile. I'm not too sure how your body will react to it, but I have high hopes. The green-haired boy felt his mask concealing all the strenuous feeling begin to fail, the cracks in his demeanor from all the troubles he had been dealing with recently creaking at the seams. What about the person with the regeneration quirk? Do they know what's happening to their cells? Izuku said quietly, his eyes shaking as tears began to pool in his eyes. His heart felt heavy in his chest, the swirl of heart-wrenching emotions he had been trying to hide for so long threatening to leak out. Nezu let out a small chuckle. Your friend, Hyde, had offered to help, hadn't he? It was as if his words had knocked the wind from Izuku's chest, the green-haired boy drawing in a sharp, deep breath before a quiet sob trailed behind. It was the rare times like this, which only happened once in a blue moon, that Izuku realized how fortunate he was in his situation to be surrounded by people who seemed to care, and how incredibly indebted he was to his teachers, his mother, and the few friends who stood strong by his side. Thank you. Thank you all. So much. He realized that while his situation was far from perfect, there were probably thousands of people worldwide with similar quick problems, with no one available to help them. Just like Kaneki, he had been blessed by meeting the right people at the right moment, and while his situation was far from perfect and the trail of death and horror which followed him would haunt him forever. Things wouldn't get much better after this. In fact, Izuku was sure nothing between his classmates would change, but Izuku was utterly glad to be at UA, and he was so grateful his heroes were willing to help him too. Chapter 42. The Friends Which Never Left. I know I've written things about self-harm before, but this chapter contains pretty detailed writing of the thoughts and processes someone might feel while dealing with such a topic. Please do not read if it might trigger you. It starts once your rocket enters Deka's dorm room. In the days after his meeting with Nezu passed, the feelings of happiness didn't stick around for long, the gratitude which surrounded his relief never faded. After some back and forth discussions with the officers on his case and Nezu, Izuku was finally given permission to test the food they had created, which turned out to be an amazing success. It certainly wasn't as good as the previous food they had been feeding him, and far worse than the food he had collected himself while hunting on the streets, but the relief he felt knowing he was finally able to eat something which wasn't from a person who had been harmed left him in tears of joy. Once he had returned back to the dorms after their successful first trial, with a small smile on his face, Uraraka and Todoroki had almost instantly come up to see him and started asking him questions at the rare yet welcoming expression. It only took a few minutes for the trio to reach Izuku's bedroom, where he explained the great news, for Uraraka to launch himself at her with a delighted laugh, Todoroki awkwardly offering a comforting smile over her shoulder before the brunette had dragged him along into the hug as well. In that small moment, Izuku allowed himself to bathe in the rare warmth and comfort he felt coming from his friends. It was good, it felt nice, the weight of the guilt and stress slowly trickling off of him. Izuku knew deep down it would take far longer, maybe even years, for all the guilt and hate he felt within himself to disappear, but it was a start that he could only have dreamt of before. It was because of these unreal feelings that once the pair of them had left him to his own devices that the overwhelming feeling of emptiness struck him hard, the thoughts flying through his mind making him doubt himself. The awful, somber guilt he felt clawed at his chest. The silence of the room deafening as the smile dropped off his face once his door shut behind his friends, leaving him all alone. He stood in silence for a while, contemplating whether it would be worth going down to the living room with them and the rest of their class before he brushed the idea off, slowly walking to his window before sitting in the dark of his own room, wishing to feel the chill of the nighttime air. The stars which scattered the night sky were morbidly comforting as they reminded him of the freedom he once had. Izuku dragged in a long, deep breath. It was all starting to become a little too much for him, the two extremes of kindness and fear which were sent his way, making him feel so wanted and yet so depressed and alone all at the same time. It made him feel horrible inside, as his mind fooled him into believing he wasn't being grateful enough for the lengths and extremes his friends were going for him. Yet Izuku felt as if he didn't deserve any of it at all. The next day Izuku was called to see the principal again, awkwardly bringing up the possibilities of rejoining his class heroic lessons, which left Nezu in the dilemma of explaining to him why that would be possible, at least for now. As much as I would like for things to go back to some sort of normalcy with your training during heroic lessons, Midoriya, I'm afraid that won't be possible until we have proven that the food we have developed holds up during training with your quirks just as well as it does now. Nezu had let out a strained breath. We are still on a thin edge with the officers regarding your situation, and we need to keep them at least somewhat satisfied with the safety of the other students here at UA, even if we all know that wouldn't be a problem anyway. Izuku was left feeling downhearted. That being said, Nezu had continued after a moment of thought, we were able to secure you a spot in the licensing exam with your classmates. You will not be allowed to train with them, however, I have already consulted Izawa-san, and he has agreed to watch over your training. The green-haired boy blocked back in shock, jaw slightly slackened before he gulped it closed. I didn't think I would be allowed to, Izuku murmured out, still surprised at his chance. Nezu nodded his head with a pleasant smile. One of the main reasons why we worked so quickly to discover a sustainable food source for you was so you could continue on with your hero career, he huffed, letting out an amused chuckle as he saw the shock on Izuku's face. One of the reasons we went to such lengths for you to come back to UA. Not because of One for All, but because of your heroic mindset which drives you, after all. Nezu turned away from Izuku as he walked around the table to grab a few papers from his desk drawers before handing them to Izuku. I will have to admit though, the mammal began calmly, it took a lot of convincing to persuade them to allow you to join. I may have promised them that you would take a psychological evaluation beforehand with Hound Dog that I'm afraid you will have to attend, but other than that you are good to go. Izuku nodded silently before Nezu spoke up again. However, he began, his tone dropping into something more serious, and he looked at Izuku, grasping all of the boy's attention. You are not permitted, under any circumstances, to use your Kagyun during the exam or any lessons in the future. I'm sure you can understand the issues that would cause. As Nezu had finished talking, Izuku gulped and agreed. The next few days were followed by his heroic lessons taking place in empty facilities with only himself and Izawa around. Unfortunately for Izuku, there wasn't enough time for him to try and come up with his own super move, but Izawa helped him far more than he had expected him to get back into the ring of things with One for All. The excessive cap on the amount of exercise he had been allowed over the last month surprisingly affected his agile mobility, which his sensei spent no time wasting into perfecting again. Soon the provisional license exam came around, and Izuku's new food had been given the full go-ahead and was finally granted permission to be used whilst he was training, much to his and the UA staff involved relief. In the morning before the exam, Izuku was finally given access to his hero costume, now fitted with a few extra pockets for the food he had been entrusted with, changing in the privacy of one of the school's many toilets to hide his scars which littered his body from watchful eyes. Izuku had looked at his appearance in the mirror, taking into account the new additions to his costume, weighing him down slightly more than it had previously, before dashing out to the school bus where the rest of his class were boarding one of the school's buses. He took the few minutes it would take to reach the bus to adjust the weight of the food on his body, the extra weight far more than he would have liked, but Izuku had learned better than to push his luck. He knew it was only out of necessity, and it was something which would have to stay. Once he had arrived, Izuku jogged over towards Uraraka, who shared with him a present look of surprise at his arrival, before taking in the shocked glares and awkward stares scattered throughout his classmates. The expressions he was certainly wasn't going to be forgotten anytime soon, as whispers of contempt and confusion filtered through them as he joined them on the bus. Izuku had awkwardly met their stares, a strained grin on his lips, as he tried to settle the tension in the air, his gaze momentarily landing on the few who knew all, and yet nothing. They had all looked at him as if he was nothing but a stranger entering their home. Iida, Tokoyami and the rest all looked away once their eyes had met, the rest of the class still sitting awkwardly around them. Thankfully, Izuku hadn't had to deal with them for too long, as Uraraka pulled him to sit between Todoroki and herself, sitting in silence thought out the journey as he listened to Uraraka trying her hardest to make some kind of a conversation to fill in the awkward gaps. He was thankful that she was trying, her voice filtering through his head as they replaced the words lingering doubt and torment his mind continued to feed him. It felt as if it took hours for the bus to reach the testing site for the provisional licensing exam, his class all scuttling off the bus to get a closer look at the overwhelmingly large arena it was going to take place in. In the short moment of distracted attention, Izuku gave himself a chance to breathe freely as he calmed his nerves for the test. It was unconventional, taking the test after being out of practice against a wider range of opponents for so long, but Izuku didn't feel as if he would have too much trouble in passing. The unfair advantage that came with having two quirks was certainly going to help in the long run, even if he wasn't permitted to voluntarily use them. Well, it wasn't his fault that his regeneration and increased stamina liked to work on their own. The only thing which seemed to cloud his mind was the mental exhaustion he had been constantly feeling the whole ride there. Izuku was tired, he just wanted to go home. The test went ahead with little issues, with no notable interruption to stop their class from succeeding and passing just as expected, other than Bakugo and Todoroki, who both seemed to have gotten into some sort of scuffle at one point, causing the examiner to dock points from each of them. Izuku had glanced at Todoroki out of the corner of his eyes, the angry yells from Bakugo had captured the majority of the attention in the stadium, as his expression softened in concern for his friend. Izuku wanted to help, leaning towards him as he was about to take a step forward to speak when he hesitated. His raised arm froze in mid-air before he had pulled it back towards him, keeping to himself as he watched Momo, followed closely by Jiru, walking over to comfort him. Izuku had watched in silence, keeping his gaze on Todorikis's expression as it morphed from disappointment into a dim yet small smile as Momo had spoken. Todoroki would be all right, Izuku knew that even though his friend was far from being socially capable, he had far more friends than just Izuku. There would always be people there to help him, whether Izuku was around or not. The intrusive thoughts which roamed Izuku's head didn't help the exhaustion he felt from deep within him. The sun had just dropped behind the skyline when Izuku finally arrived at the dorms, after leaving his few friends as he went for his final meal of the day in the main staff office of UA, spending an extra hour after eating talking with All Might before he was escorted back. Izuku was really starting to hate the thought of having to go back to the school building to eat. The watchful glances of the heroes, even though he had been taught with all the interrogation and followed all the rules, never seemed to leave him alone. It was only as he arrived in the privacy of his own room did he feel like he was finally out of the hero's eyes, finally allowed to be himself without the nagging feelings welling up inside him about being treated like a ticking time bomb of a child. At least if he was allowed to be in his room alone, not wanting to think about the possibilities of cameras being hidden in his room, as ridiculous and illegal as it would be. Izuku walked silently to the reinforced glass of his dorm window before leaning his forehead onto the cold glass, unable to walk out onto his locked balcony with the key locked away from him for the other students' safety, as he mourned the lack of freedom he craved to have again. He would just have to wait for the day it would finally be given back to him. Izuku wasn't as good at hiding the sorrow which seemed to follow him as he thought, Uraraka had decided as she silently watched him from where she was sat with the rest of Class 1 for their meal, as he had silently stalked his way up the stairs straight to his room from the front door. Even though he was finally free from his kidnappers and free to stay at UA, the last few weeks had been hard on him, and it was clear and painful to see. It hurt, and it broke her heart, to know that even though so many people knew his secrets and were trying to help, he was still hurting inside. Izuku was tired, and Uraraka was starting to get worried again. She had assumed that Izuku thought that he was better at hiding his sorrows than he really was, and while the majority of the class had turned a blind eye, she could still see it. Uraraka could see straight through it, and she knew, deep down, that this was a far different pain than what had been haunting her best friend before. Uraraka's watchful gaze caught the attention of Todoroki, who was sitting beside her, his own look of concern flowing over his face as he caught the tail end of Midoriya walking up the stairs to his room without a word. Uraraka, Todoroki began, shooting her a look of worry as he pulled his eyes away from the stairs towards her. Uraraka's grim expression marring her face as she too turned away and looked back towards Todoroki. I'm going to go see if Deku is alright, Uraraka had begun softly, her tone quiet so as to not pick up the unwanted attention of the rest of their classmates scattered around the room. Todoroki leveled her with an understanding nod, knowing instantly what she was talking about. I'll make sure no one follows you up, Uraraka, Todoroki replied calmly, offering her a weak smile as she gave him a grateful nod before quietly slipping out of her seat before slowly following Midoriya up the stairs, with only Todoroki and Bakubas's all-knowing watchful eyes following behind her. The sounds of the joy in the kitchen seemed to muffle out more and more the further she walked up the stairs on the boys' sides of the dormitories. The rows of steps shortly followed by the wall of numbered doors fell behind her as she reached the Izuku's dorm room before offering a short knock on the door. Deku? It's me? Can I come in and talk to you? There was a beat of silence where no reply followed, leaving Uraraka to let out a concerned sigh. She looked towards his door handle, contemplating her choices before reaching forward to see if he had left his door unlocked. With a twist of her wrist, the door surprisingly opened, leaving Uraraka standing at the dark room doorway as she slowly peered inside. Her eyes only took a millisecond to come into contact with the figure she could confidently say was Midoriya, his hunched-over body leant against the side of his bed as he faced towards the window, looking up at the sky slowly filling in with stars. Slowly, Uraraka edged into the room, her footsteps soft against the carpet as she calmly spoke again. Deku? Are you alright? I'm fine. His words had sounded somewhat convincing, but the shift in how his body curled up on itself was enough for her to make her move and sit down beside him. Deku. She paused, her eyes widening as she caught sight of Izuku's hand as he shifted slightly away from their close proximity. As droplets of blood rolled down his hand, Uraraka took in the sight of the end Izuku's thumb completely missing. Shock and unrequited concern flowed into her as her voice dropped into nothing but a whisper as she had reached forward subconsciously to his hand just as Izuku had pulled back away, the fear in his eyes going unseen as Izuku desperately prayed for her to go away. But, Deku. I thought the food you were getting was enough. I don't get it. Izuku could hear Achako's voice shake as tears began to overwhelm her as he tried to stutter back a response, only to cringe at the sight of his hand that she had just seen. Izuku felt all the urges to fight against the truth fall flat as he let out a strained sigh before looking at his best friend with all the pain and anguish resonating in his eyes. The sight of her watery eyes, glistening from the sunset light, and the horrified jaw-slackened expression she wore would haunt only the cruelest of nightmares to come, and it was at that moment that Uraraka realized that he was doing that for something far more than his state of hunger. The self-inflicted pain twinged at the nerves in his fingertip, the small yet significant injury he had just caused to himself, numbing the anxiety and loneliness he felt as if he deserved, all without alerting the heroes that he was forcing his body to regenerate. Izuku knew far better than anyone that the 3 meals a day were far more than enough than his body truly needed. Izuku had almost forgotten how good the taste of fresh human blood tasted on his lips, and the taste was only a bonus of sharp aching pain that came with it. The food they are creating for me is great, it works. But I can't help wanting to remind myself of the feeling of my fingers and toes regrowing over and over again. He began morbidly as he looked towards his hands, not putting any thought behind the words he spoke, far too entranced with the sight of his thumb slowly regrowing. It reminds me of what it feels like to truly be the monster I was created to be. Uraraka was horrified, tears streaming down her face with concern and worry as she leant forward to pull Izuku from his trance, cupping her hands around his face as she brought his face up to look at her. Midoriya. Pete, please stop this. Okay? Uraraka cried, sniffling harshly as her own thumb rubbed Izuku's tears away from his eyes. I know things are bad at the moment. But I'm here for you. Midoriya could help but cringe at her words, scoffing slightly as he lifted his healthy hand up to push away Uraraka's palms from his face. As if that has ever helped you or anyone else, all I ever do is cause you more pain than necessary, Izuku cursed with a scowl, looking away from her with narrowed eyes as he directed his pent-up anger and anguish towards himself, the walls around him crumbling away into dust. I'm a horrible friend to you and Todoroki. I don't understand why you don't hate me, or why you aren't scared like the rest of them. Uraraka seemed to be at a loss for words. But why it wasn't your fault. You told us yourself. Midoriya gritted his teeth, letting out the anger he felt within his words. That's beside the point. I know the kind of state you were in when you ended up in hospital because of me. The scar you've been trying to hide from me alone says more than enough. You almost died. I almost killed you. Uraraka sat back in shocked horror as she took in the anguish clearly written on Izuku's skin, the rivers of tears, and the patches of red skin which covered his face, contrasting against the darkness of his single ghoulish eye. Uraraka could feel her heart crumbling into thousands of pieces for the boy she cared about, the boy who she couldn't help but adore and worry for with all her heart. And I let you. I let you because I knew you needed help. I've told you so many times before that I wanted to help you. You always try to do things on your own. The scar is the cause of my own actions, not yours. Uraraka leant forward and grabbed hold of Midoriya's shaking shoulders, looking him straight in the eyes as she pleaded with him. Izawa spoke to me when I was in the hospital and told me he was going to do everything he could to make sure you were able to continue becoming a hero, Deku. Your actions at the training camp saved lives. You've saved my life at the USJ, and you saved Iida's and Todoroki's too. Uraraka exclaimed, shaking her head, you're not a monster to us, you're a hero. You're my hero. As her words filtered through the air, Izuku could only cry weakly as he broke down before her. Falling into her arms, sobbing loudly as she brought him into a tight hug, rocking him slowly side to side as he muttered out apologies after apologies towards her. Ochako could only sit in silence as she softly shushed his sorrowful words, quite gently stroking his green hair down as Izuku tucked himself away into the side of her neck. It felt like hours, the sun finally set and long gone, Izuku's sobs had quietened down enough for Ochako to understand him. The stars and the moon twinkling calmly through the window. Why does it seem as if all our conversations end up like this when they are done? Izuku had murmured out quietly, leaving Ochako to let out a breathy chuckle as she responded. I'm not quite sure, she began, before slowly pulling away and cupping his face once again with her thumb, as she offered him a soft, genuine smile. We need to start having better conversations, don't we? So, please come and talk to me if you ever feel like you are in despair. I will always be here for you, no matter what happens, okay? Izuku could only offer a silent nod of agreement, pulling away as he turned to sit down with his back against the side of his bed, too ashamed to look her in the eyes. Thank you, Uraraka. The depth of Izuku's words struck a silent chord at Ochako as she gave him a sad look whilst he looked towards the floor again. The tense atmosphere which surrounded them left Uraraka a little lost as to what to do when she suddenly was overcome with an odd urge. Quietly, Izuku could hear her shifting forward in her seat as he gazed down at the tufts of fluff in the carpet, unsure of what to say when suddenly he felt a small pressure against his cheek. Izuku stilled, his head frozen as his eyes darted over to where Ochako was sitting beside him as she leaned back away from him, noticing both her hands still stuck beside her sides. Izuku slowly felt his cheeks filling up with a tight flush of embarrassment, reaching his fingering up to delicately touch the skin that he realized that the girl he cared about the most had just kissed. Lost for words, Izuku could only stare at her as she silently gave him a small caring smile before she silently left the room, leaving him to his own devices. The small actions only took a few seconds before the door closed behind her as Izuku slowly came to grips with what had just happened. As his fingers reached up and his palm covered the almost sensitive piece of skin on his cheek, Izuku could help himself but begin to cry again. It didn't make him feel much better, but it helped the unconditional feelings of love his friends had sent him and the promises they gave to always stand by his side. Izuku knew things were going to be rough, and he certainly hadn't been wrong, but at that moment, Izuku could help but hope that things would slowly start to get better. The feelings he felt would probably never completely fade, but his friends which never left would always be there for him, and the efforts his heroes were doing for him would one day finally pay off. I've been wanting to write this chapter forever. I guess I can say this is now officially an Izuacha story lol. Please remember that kissing people out of the blue is not necessarily a good idea. Please always take into account the situation and the person you want to kiss or touch before taking such actions. You never know what situations people have been in the past and the negative reactions they may have towards it from traumatic experiences. Uraraka kissed him because she wanted to silently let him know that even though he hates himself, people still love him and that people still care about him. I know it might not sound romantic or cool, but at least ask before doing such things lol, or at least apologize after if you didn't. Which Ichako will be doing next chapter like a good role model. Of course, if you are already in a relationship with someone and boundaries have already been set that you do not need to worry about this. This is just for people who want to interact with people they are less familiar with. I know I personally from bad experiences would definitely be put off or would panic and cry if someone kissed or touched me before asking permission and making sure I was aware before it happened, but I'm just a random person on the internet who loves angsty fanfics. Life lessons with budgies. D. Chapter 43. A sense of normalcy. The days after Uraraka had left his room, Izuku fell back into the daily routine the rest of his classmates were following, routed back into the fast-paced lessons the hero course had to offer, as if nothing had ever happened. The normalcy doesn't make him feel much better, but it helped him adjust to the kindness and care the heroes were doing for him. The lingering notion of isolation slowly faded away as he adapted to the new social aspects of his life which were falling into place. It had taken some time, but Izuku was slowly starting to feel more involved and wanted within his class, the missing feeling of belonging carefully repairing itself within his fragile heart. The feelings certainly weren't coming back to him overnight, but it was progress, and progress was far better than nothing at all. Izuku was learning to live with it. After the argument in his bedroom, Izuku had decided to stick to his word, as much as it pained him to have to place his problems upon his friend's shoulders. It was tough, each word that would leave his mouth each time he spoke would leave him feeling drained and tired, but in the end, it worked, sort of. There was little relief that could free him from the burdens he carried, but it was enough to allow him to slowly work towards the haphazard state he was in just before the summer training camp. A mix of both the happiness he felt with his friends and the undeniable memories which would haunt more so than every once in a while. Thankfully, however, Uraraka was more than willing to listen and comfort him whenever the memories would become too much for him. The free time he had on his hands without the stress of food finally gave way for his mind to go through all unprocessed trauma that had been stored away in the back of his mind. The depressing and concerning acts that Izuku had made were kept silent between the pair of friends, Uraraka keeping what she saw that night in his bedroom a secret for his own sake of mind. It hadn't taken a genius for them to be fully aware of the possible consequences that would follow if their teachers found out, no doubt considering the circumstances that Izuku was in, even if the heroes had agreed to help him through it. Izuku couldn't bear the thought of being confined once again, that thought alone leaving him in another spiral of anxiety and stress, breaking down in his bedroom with Ichako hugging him tightly only a few days after the night of the provisional licensing exam. The tingles of pain which should have been in his arm silently reminded him that no matter how much he repented, he would always be a part Ghoul. Slowly but surely Izuku was able to integrate his social life back in with the rest of his classmates, finally bringing himself to talk to people in his class again after having a long talk with Iida, after Uraraka had pestered him every waking second of the day to talk with him. It had become apparent very quickly after Iida had come clean that he was unsure of where he stood with the situation Izuku had been cursed with, Midoriya, Uraraka and Todoroki spending an afternoon discussing their shared past in private. The convocation had been long and tiring, but eventually, they had managed to come to some sort of level standing. I can't say I'm happy about who you are or what you have done, but I've finally come to realize that our teachers wouldn't have let you back into UA if they had considered you a threat. The conversation had begun strained and tense after Uraraka had finally convinced Iida to listen to Izuku's side of the story. Iida finally got his chance to put forward his own thoughts as Izuku had awkwardly sat in silence, accepting everything that was said to him. Iida had held a grimace tightly on his face as he had spoken, looking over to Uraraka for guidance about what to say, who quickly prompted him to continue with a small smile on her face. I know I have been very distant to you recently. Iida had begun slowly, releasing a deep tiresome sigh before continuing, but from what you've told me, I understand now that you didn't have control of the situations which occurred. Iida's normally proper speech pattern faltered a little as he looked over to Todoroki for a brief second, who sat comfortably by Izuku's side as he contemplated his next words. As much as it pains me to admit it, I'm thankful that you saved me during the Hosu attacks. I don't remember seeing you there at the time, but I saw the news in the hospital after I had awoken. Iida hesitated as he looked over to Todoroki as he continued. And I know at least I would have died that night if it wasn't for your help. The trio of friends watched as their blue-haired classmate had lowered his head in shame. I was too overcome by my anger for revenge for my brother to realize the danger I had got myself in. I remember running into that night feeling as if I could do something to make it all better and left with the feeling that I was going to die, only to wake up in the hospital the day after with only a scar and a fractured hand. Iida sucked in a deep breath before sighing wearily, looking back up slowly to where Izuku was sitting with an unreadable mixture of gratitude and grief within his tired eyes. After learning about who it was that saved me that night in Hosu during the summer camp, I'm afraid I've been a little lost of where I've stood in this situation and my personal view of you, Midoriya. Iida paused, slowly bowing his head apologetically before he continued. I'm sorry I didn't come and confront you first before coming to a conclusion. It was wrong of me to judge you for the situation you were placed in before knowing your side of the story. Uraraka and Todoroki shared wide eyes as Izuku looked at his old friend weakly, slowly speaking as he responded. I don't blame you at all. You're not the first person to be afraid of who I am before I told them what had happened to me. Iida offered Izuku a grim wince as he accepted Izuku's response, hesitantly looking over to Todoroki as he asked him one of the questions on his mind. I assume the Hosu attack was when you discovered who Midoriya was? Iida asked slowly as Todoroki nodded softly in response. I only saw his face for a split second, but it was enough for me to recognize him. Iida let out a small hum, lowering his head in thought. I thought as much. Iida replied with an understanding nod before looking to Uraraka questioningly as he asked, I haven't the faintest clue how you found out, Uraraka. Uraraka gave them an awkward smile as she lifted her hand to rub the back of her head before she lowered her hand and spoke softly, I found out during the USJ attack. I was pretty scared at the time, but Deku saved me from the villains. Iida blinked in surprise, sitting back up in his seat. Oh, I see now, he began, his voice returning to the orderly tone it was naturally. We had assumed that you may have found out before we had started the school year. The trio of friends shared a look at Iida's words, worry slowly forming in Midoriya's stomach as Uraraka's curiosity finally got the better of her, peeping out a question. The trio were all intrigued for the answer for. Iida? What do you mean by we? Iida awkwardly blinked before letting out a self-conscious chuckle, trying to hide the subtle grimace below. The other and I who saw you that day at the summer camp, we haven't been talking about who you are if that's what you are worried about, but Mineta came to us and had started asking me about your relationship, whilst bringing the others in. Iida let out a bothersome sigh. It seems out of everyone who saw you, from what I can gather, only Mineta seems to be the one who is the most against you being here. I don't think he has realized, unlike the others and myself, that the teachers wouldn't let you in here if you were a threat to us. Midoriya looked between the four of them at their different expressions before falling into thought as Uraraka nodded her head up in realization. That makes a lot of sense now. I guess that also explains his awful behavior towards me recently. Todoroki leant forward and asked her about what she meant about his behavior as Izuku was too lost in his mind, interpreting what Iida had said to them. The thought that the others who had spotted him weren't entirely disgusted with him eased his sore heart off slightly, not too surprised that Mineta was the only one who was from the memory of his reaction. Anyway, Deku-kun and I only met at the entrance exam when he saved me from that giant robot. I think that's probably the reason why we became friends so quickly. That during our first hero lesson on the second day he saved me again there. Uraraka said with a chuckle, drawing Izuku's attention back as a small, warm smile formed on his face. I think we all sort of figured out that the pair of you both knew somehow, one way or another. Iida finished with a small smile as well, looking at Midoriya, and his two friends sat on either side of him warmly as he bowed apologetically. You've both always seemed rather close to each other. I assumed when you had rescued her during the entrance exam that you had known her before. Sorry for jumping to conclusions. Uraraka and Midoriya both felt their faces warm up slightly at the secret information of what had happened in their relationship from the unknowing words Iida had spoken, Todoroki sitting plainly in his usual expression beside them. It's alright, Iida. Izuku quickly began, frantically waving off Iida's apology with an awkward yet honest laugh. I forgive you. Let's just be friends and move past this, please? Iida could only offer him a warm agreeing smile. That does sound like an appropriate idea to me. The friendship which had re-blossomed between the group of friends was what Izuku could have called a blessing in disguise, and he couldn't be more grateful that Iida had listened and understood him. Some things would be hard to change, Mineta still terrified of his presence and the others still a little bit off towards him, but it seemed as if once they had learnt of his and Iida rekindled friendship, people started to warm up again. Talking more freely and comfortingly than Izuku thought that they ever would again. So as Asuka's social life with more than just a couple of people bloomed, the tension in the class had slowly begun to melt away. In some ways, Izuku found it all rather odd, the similarities in his friends' reactions before and after he had told them the truth. Part of his mind had been trying to convince him that it was all just a play of guilt and pity on their part, but Izuku did his best to push that thought away. At first, the reactions he had received from his now closest friends had terrified him. Every person who saw in him in those incriminating positions had sent thorns of fear through his heart. But now he had admittedly become a little numb to the experience of someone's disgust and anger directed towards him. It was sad to think that it had gotten to a point where now his friends' initial reactions had done little to nothing other than aid the overwhelming feeling of loneliness he was fighting, compared to mental torture the blood and the murders on his hands had left him with. Izuku had mentally shaken his head away from those thoughts again, bringing his mind away from the dark tunnel. His mind always seemed to lead him down. Another thing that had been on his mind almost every hour of the day was the kiss that Uraraka had planted softly on his cheek. The unrealistic thought alone of her lips on his face had left him in a blushing mess, but it had happened, she had kissed him. For the first few days after, Uraraka hadn't brought the subject up to him, and Izuku had no idea where to even begin with approaching the subject to find the meaning behind it, mainly being too scared to even attempt to. So when Uraraka came up to him after school earlier that day and apologized for kissing him so suddenly without asking if it was okay, Izuku was a little lost for words. Deku. Can I talk to you for a second? Uraraka had called out to him from behind as he was walking back to the dorms by himself. His friend's voice had caused him to stiffen slightly with a flush flaunting across his cheeks as he awkwardly turned to face her with a smile. Yay. Sure. He began nervously, a small chuckle making its way through his lips. His smiles fell into a wider, eyes-closed grin. His smile was quickly returned as Uraraka jogged to walk beside him. Ignoring the flushing feeling on his cheeks, Izuku was the first one to speak up again as Uraraka looked ahead, lost in thought. So, what did you want to talk to me about, Uraraka-san? Izuku began nervously as he grabbed into the straps of his bag tightly over his shoulders. His line of sight heavily concentrated on the path in front of him to spare himself the embarrassment of his bed friend spotting his tomato-red face. Uraraka had let out an anxious sigh as she fumbled with her hands, looking away as she spoke in a nervous rush. I just wanted to apologize for kissing you last week. Uraraka looked away awkwardly, her body tense beside his waiting for his response as she lowered her head guiltily. I shouldn't have done that without asking, you know? It was pretty rude and inconsiderate of me. I know you still have problems when people suddenly touch you, Izuku looked at Uraraka with surprise as she had slowly trailed off, utterly not expecting those words to have come out of her mouth. Was that the reason why she hadn't spoken or mentioned anything about it afterwards? Did she really consider what she had done to be rude and inconsiderate? Izuku had thought it was odd that she hadn't mentioned or spoken to him much at all, but in some ways, her honesty and apology now were somewhat comforting and a relief to say the least. A small, light-hearted chuckle fell from Asuka's lips as he felt a little bit of embarrassment overcome him, his hand lifting anxiously rub his hair as some form of distraction as he happily disarmed her of her apology. Oh, it was okay, honestly, please don't worry about it. Izuku began, tripping over his words before his nerves got the better of him and made the whole situation far more embarrassing. I'm not trying to say I didn't like it or anything. I wasn't expecting it. The pair of students looked at each other for a silent moment as they both took in what Izuku had said before both of them felt their cheeks warming up. Ah well, that's good then. IGUESS. The conversation was still causing bubbles to form in Izuku's stomach as he walked towards the bins behind the dorm room to empty their trash. His heart warmed at her honesty and consideration. The sight of his friend blushing with embarrassment, making their little conversation all the more entertaining. Izuku honestly couldn't remember the last time he had felt so warm and happy after their walk back to the dorms. With a smile on his face, Izuku finally reached the bigs where he reached over to lift the lid and throw the bags into the trash, only for a face to appear behind it once he closed the lid back down. Boo! Izuku let out a loud yelp. AHH. He jumped back with fright, dropping the lid down of the bin with a loud bang, and he turned to look away. Oh, sorry for scaring you. You're the guy who managed to escape the League of Villains, right? Izuku flinched back with a cringe at the stranger's choice of words, gathering his bearings as he tried to get a better look at the guy who was talking to him through a wall. The face, which seemed to be attached to the side of the building, had wide blue eyes with a flick of blonde hair as they watched Izuku with a wide smile, not helping the internal battle Izuku was facing as he tried not to freak out at the seemingly decapitated head on the side of the wall. Izuku's cautious tone shook as the sudden adrenaline in his system began to calm. Who are you? The face on the wall only laughed aloud at his expense, making Izuku sweat drop before ignoring his question. My friend was just telling me this morning how she overheard someone say that the two first years had managed to escape from the League of Villains. I was just too curious and had to come by and ask for myself. It's pretty impressive that you did it together on your own. Izuku straightened himself out as he gave an unsure response, looking around slightly for anyone who could save him from the unusual conversation, only to come up with naught. Thank you? Izuku began confusedly. The blonde-haired guy had opened his mouth to respond before pausing with a frozen smile on their face, before letting out a much more relaxed wholesome chuckle before he spoke. I'm sorry. That was probably a little insensitive of me to drop that question on you suddenly. Sometimes I get ahead of myself. The face in the wall said before vanishing back into the wall before Izuku's very eyes. As Izuku looked around widely for the face, the other boy popped his head out of the ground just before him, catching Izuku by surprise and causing him to jump up slightly again. Whoa! That's a cool quirk. Izuku thought momentarily with widened eyes of surprise as he saw the fascinating quirk at work, the blonde-haired dude still talking away to him as Izuku saw went unnoticed. I will admit, you're much more pleasant to talk to than your friend. The head now poking out the floor continued, as Izuku quickly caught on to who he was talking about with a weary sigh. Izuku really didn't want to imagine the colorful language Bakugo could have possibly used while talking to them. I'm sorry about Bakugo if he did anything. He can be a bit of a handful sometimes. Izuku reasoned tiredly with an awkward laugh. The other boy just grinned at Izuku, letting out a small understanding hum. I see, well sorry to cut this short, but I've gotta go. With that his head seemed to twist around on the ground to face the other way before zooming away thought and vanishing beneath the floor, leaving Izuku speechless to what had happened behind. It was only after Izuku gathered his senses that he sniffed that air, only for the man's scent he had subconsciously sniffed vanishing from the immediate area, leaving Izuku with no trace of which direction they had gone. That was new, it was like the scented trail that people usually left behind had vanished along with the guy. There wasn't much point in trying to find out who or where they had gotten, it wasn't like Izuku could do much, and he was well aware of the security around the school. With a quick look around, discovering he was alone and that the dude was hanging around, Izuku gave a tired sigh before yawning, drained from the sudden conversation as he slowly made his way back to the dorms for a nap. Then school resumed the next day. The class had begun with Izawa settling them in for a lecture instead of a hero training for their first session. An assembly had been held that morning, finally discussing the new changes brought to the school and the dorm system as a whole, but the only thing that the first years of Class 1 had picked up were the few words hero studies that the principal had spoken off. This intrigue had followed them into the classroom as Izawa answered the questions about it, which had been bugging them all. I'm sure you all heard Nezu in assembly this morning. I was going to talk to you about these new opportunities for you at a later date, but it seems as if the school board has pushed them forward to first years. Izawa began, rolling up his sleeping bag as he sighed at the thought of having to explain something early into his class school career that he had originally anticipated. These hero studies the principal spoke about are your next step into the hero careers, so this is no time to be slacking off. Izuku sat between his classmates as they all nodded with understanding, noticing the odd few raising their hands to ask their sensei questions. Izawa looked around the room at the few hands before his eyes landed on Asui, prompting her to ask away. Sensei, I've never heard of hero studies before, how are they different to the work internships we did after the sports festival? Asui asked, a few of her classmates lowering their hands as they agreed with her question. Izawa promptly nodded. These hero studies are very similar to the work experience you all participated in a few months ago, he began. The only difference here is that this will be far closer to the real thing than before, especially those of you with your provisional licenses. Those without, I'm afraid, will have to stay behind. A low murmur fluttered around the classroom as Izuku looked behind him to offer Todoroki a comforting smile, knowing that the weight of not passing his exam had been bugging his friend for the last week since the exams. Todoroki looked up slight once Izuku had caught his eye and offered back his own small yet grateful twitch in the lips. Before looking back to the front of the class, Izuku noticed that Uraraka seemed to be deep in thought. Aizawa cut off the noise in the room with a swift use of his quirk, the class snapping back into silence as he cleared his throat and carried on. As I was saying, those of you with your hero licenses will have the opportunity to search for your own hero studies. Uraraka quickly raised her hand, jumping out of her seat, causing Izuku to jump as Aizawa paused to listen to her. But wait. What was the point of all the effort we went to in the sports festival if we're going to be scouted again now? Uraraka spoke in an exasperated yet panicked tone. Aizawa let out a small breath, wishing his students would let him finish as he answered her question with what he was going to say anyway. The sports festival was your opportunity to get scouted by heroes over the country for your internships. However, I need to remind you that your hero studies are something you will need to find access to on your own. This is your chance to use the connections you made from your internships and work your way up the ladder. Aizawa started, addressing his class. This isn't part of your classwork, so you will need to find these opportunities on your own. This also means, however, that it may be more difficult for some of you to find hero study placements if you were not scouted before. That is why I, as well as your other teachers, will be around to help give you any advice or references you may need, but don't expect us to find these placements for you. Ask your friends and the people you have already met to get your foot in the door. Aizawa looked over to Uraraka, who was still standing up behind her desk as he finished. Does that answer your question, Uraraka? He asked as his student lowered herself back into her chair with a quick nod of the head and apology for shouting out. Good, with that in mind. We will carry on with today's lesson, discussing different ways of networking to help you in these next coming weeks. As the lessons continued, Aizawa discussed and talked about different strategies famous heroes took to get into the industry. Izuku couldn't help but let his mind wander around to possible heroes he would want to work with and the possibilities of conflict once they would inevitably learn who he was. It was tough enough having to face All Might, his teachers and his classmates after the summer attack. Izuku did want to start to think of the possibilities of other heroes' reactions and the possible information leaks caused by heroes who couldn't keep their mouths shut. Izuku let out a sigh as he scribbled down a few unsure names onto the piece of paper handed out to them. He could only hope that maybe Gran Torino would want him back. Chapter 44. The Big Three of UA. Their next scheduled hero lesson started a little differently than usual. Today's lesson will be a little different than usual. Continuing on from yesterday, we've organized some guests to come and speak to you about their own experiences with hero work studies. Aizawa addressed his class, his eyes scanning over the class for their attention, before turning to face the door. All right, you can come in now. The classroom door opened, welcoming three students all vastly different in appearances through the door. As Aizawa turned back to his students, the three guests walking up to stand beside him. Class 1 all offhandedly starting murmuring slightly as they recognized their upperclassmen standing before them. Izuku only took a second to recognize one of the smells on the students before matching the face of the man hiding behind the bins to the upperclassman at the front of the room. These three have a lot of experience when it comes to hero work studies, and they have lots of information which will be of use to you. You've probably already heard of them from your peers, but if not, these three students are the Big Three of UA. I suggest you take advantage of the opportunities and advice they will provide. Huh. Izuku could only wonder where his blonde upperclassman was interning with the odd quirk he had seen him using only the day or so before. They've offered to help with some training and to offer you help with your hero work studies throughout the rest of the scheduled lesson, Aizawa continued, the class nodding at his words with understanding. All thought if you have any further questions they have offered to help you outside of class too. With that said, I should probably let you introduce yourself. Amajiki, you're up first. The trio began, well attempting to introduce themselves, Izuku too lost in his own thoughts to listen to the questions Hato was firing around the room as she took over from Amajiki. As far as Izuku could remember, none of the big three had won any medals during the last sports festival he had watched at home with his mother, leaving him wondering how on earth they had developed their quirks so quickly to reach their goals and how exactly Izuku could follow in their footsteps to become a better hero. "Oh. I recognize you too." Isuka's thoughts were momentarily put on hold as Hato skipped over to the two tables he and Bakugo were seated at. A wide, disarming grin had made its way onto Hato's face as she closed the proximity between them, setting Izuku slightly on edge, still not totally comfortable with people unexpectedly approaching him. Awkwardly, Izuku replied to her, a little confused, "Hi." Hato smiled at him widely before looking between Bakugo and himself. "Aren't you the two who managed to escape from the league on your own? That's so impressive. How did you do that?" The girl's trail of questions was sharply cut off by their only saving grace, Aizawa-sensei, who silenced her with his quirk and a harsh glare. His actions simultaneously saving Hato as he shut off Bakugo's quirk, who had spun around in his chair to vilely sneer at her, his quirk lighting up in his palms. "Hato, that's enough." Izuku just sat back in shocked silence at the sudden and intrusive questions, leaving him unsure of what to say with his mouth tightly sealed as he slowly took in the stunned and uncomfortable expressions surrounding him from his classmates. The topic and situation he was in making him cringe worse than when the blonde guy had asked him while alone. Hato jumped back at Aizawa's stern voice, quickly turning to face their sensei with an awkward smile as she rubbed the back of her head guiltily. "I'm sorry, Mr. Aizawa," Hato began before turning to the two boys and offering them an apology too, before hopping back to the front of the class to stand between her friends. Aizawa let out a frustrated and tiresome sigh, turning to Mirio who was standing closest beside him. "You better get their focus back on the lesson quickly before you lose them entirely," he grumbled out as Mirio grinned brightly whilst giving him a big thumbs up. "Don't sweat it, Erasure. I'll take it from here," Mirio declared as he took a step forward to address the class. His loud voice attracted attention from all over the room. "Hey, guys. Guess what? The future's gonna be." The class all watched Mirio with a confused look. "Gonna be what? Awful." The silence around the room was enough for tumbleweeds to start rolling through the class as they all stared blankly at him, no one in class 1 understanding the joke at hand, leaving Mirio to straighten himself out before trying again. "Oh crap. It seems like none of you got my joke at all. Come on guys, this is where you're all meant to start laughing," Mirio declared brightly before realizing he wasn't going to get a reaction out of them. "My name is Mirio Tagata, and I'm your senpai. I thought this was going to be an easy day for me, but it seems like none of you has any sense of humor." Izuku sat on the right-hand side of the room and could just about hear the confused murmurs coming from some of his classmates as he tried to figure out what was going on, a little unsure on how to react. "Since none of you got my joke, it seems as if you guys are gonna need more training," Mirio declared, causing both Amajiki and Hato to look over to him with weary yet fond expressions as their friends yelled out, "Road new plan. All of you are going to fight me." The students all stared at him in shock, unsure of what on earth was going on, as Mirio turned to face Aizawa, who owned a tired and somewhat irritated expression on his face at the excitability of the blonde in front of him. "Say, Erasure, would it be alright if we went out and did some training? If you want them to experience what work studies are like, fighting us would be a rational place to start. Am I right?" Aizawa looked around his classroom at the stunned and slightly scared looks on his students' expressions at the proposal, eyes momentarily pausing over Izuku before turning back to Mirio and his friends with a sigh. "Fine, do what you want, if that's what you think is best," Aizawa began dully, before looking back over his class. "Use your kits instead of your hero costumes though, there's no point getting those destroyed again, and Midoriya stay back for a bit." Mirio cheered his way out the door, followed by a pack of nervous and excitable students closely behind him. Izuku stood by and waited with Aizawa for them all to leave. As the door finally shut behind the last few stragglers, Aizawa turned to Midoriya to ask him a quick question. "I just need to know how much you had to eat this morning before I allow you to join them," Midoriya Aizawa began calmly, with no hint of irritation or exhaustion in his voice that there had been previously in the lesson. Izuku winced a little. "It wasn't as much as I'm normally given for training lessons, since I didn't know we were going to be participating in physical training this lesson." Aizawa nodded softly. "Alright, I know it's a pain, but I need you to quickly go and check in the staff room if you have enough for afterwards." He began, walking towards the door before pausing with his hand on the handle. "There probably won't be a problem, Midoriya, and I trust your judgment, but there is no point in risking it at this stage. You know the drill." With a small smile at his sense's comforting words, Izuku offered him an understanding nod as the pair walked out of the classroom and started walking their separate ways. "Thank you, sensei. I got it." With that, Izuku quickly dashed to the office before going to the changing rooms to catch up with his friends. It didn't take long for Izuku to realize that fighting against Mirio's quirk was going to be far harder than first anticipated, as he watched half of the long-range fighters in his class go down within only a short half-minute. Mirio's quirk was something else, allowing him to phase through matter Izuku had now realized, making him almost impossible to hit. But almost still made it possible. "Midoriya. Watch out." The call out from one of his friends only gave him a minuscule advantage, as the senses with his quirk aided him immensely, giving him a large advantage over his classmates when it came to noticing their blonde-haired opponent approaching him from behind, allowing him to avoid all of the attacks sent his way. It seemed as if Mirio had caught on as well, as the pair faced off one another, as the rest of the class sat back in pain and watched while actively avoiding the fight in front of them. And it didn't take long for Izuku to realize he was the only one in their class left standing. With each move, Mirio would make Izuku was just able to scrape past and avoid the attack, with only little scraps left in their path, and every time Izuku would counter, the attacks would barely make contact before Mirio was able to activate his quirk and lessen the blow. It was only after Izuku felt himself slipping a little did he activate One for All, enhancing his senses further as he flipped over Mirio to avoid an attack. The new power boost gave Izuku the speed to kick Mirio in the back as he finished his flip, landing with all the silent grace of a ghoul behind him, quietly panting from the physical exertion. Quiet ooze from his impressed classmates would subtly be heard as Mirio was able to quickly catch himself from the attack, turning quickly around to look at Izuku with pleasant surprise and excitement. "You were able to predict my moves and avoid them on time. Do you have some sort of enhanced sense quirk?" Mirio asked, causing Izuku to pause uncomfortably as he looked over to his classmates in a moment of distraction. The eyes all watching him from all sides of the room instantly made Izuku feel exposed as he realized that they had all been intensely watching the fight. Izuku's words were cut off as Mirio pulled a dirty yet impressive trick, using his distraction against him to knock Midoriya onto the floor as his concentration was too far interested in his classmates around him, the blonde sneaking through his guard. Izuku landed on the floor with a thud. "Ouch!" Izuku groaned out in pain as he rubbed the back of his head, where he had whacked onto the floor, looking around through his wincing brows to see Mirio putting his clothes back on as Izawa walked over to them to signal the end of the match. Once Mirio had gotten his clothes on and his classmates had all managed to scrape themselves off the floor, Mirio stood before them having one final discussion before the end of the lesson. "You know, it's really rare for someone to catch me off guard. Let alone hit me. I'm really impressed with how you all work today. You first years are really something else." Mirio began cheerfully, looking happily at the group of students around him before his eyes settled on Izuku. "That being said, I really am curious to know what your quirk is, Midoriya. It was really impressive." Izuku awkwardly laughed as he rubbed the small bruise forming on his head. He couldn't really tell him that it was his ghoul quirk responsible for the advanced senses, even if almost half the people in the room knew about it. Izuku wanted to hold on to some sense of the humanity his oblivious classmates were fooled into seeing. "Oh, it's just a super strength quirk, nothing that fancy," Izuku said awkwardly, ignoring the knowing stares he was getting from some of the people in the room, the tension rising between them. Unbeknownst to him, Izawa stood at the back of the group, taking in the reactions of some of his students around the room, offhandedly overhearing the distasteful murmurs coming from Mineta about lies and the uncomfortable looks some of the other students were giving Midoriya. Oblivious to the tension, Mirio let out an impressed whistle, his hands resting on his side as he let out a chuckle. "Wow, that's even more impressive that you managed to dodge my attacks." Izuku chuckled nervously and Mirio turned away from him to address the rest of the class. "That being said, you all did really well." It was as the class was discussing how the battle went that Izuku had a question pop into his mind. Izuku began, catching Mirio's attention. "I was just wondering how your quirk works. You seem to be able to teleport and let physical matter pass through your body as well." Mirio smiled. "Actually, my quirk doesn't let me teleport at all. It's called permeation and lets me pass through things, including the floor." He began, raising his finger as he made a point. What you think is teleporting is actually just me falling through the floor, deep underground. When I come back up I just have to angle myself and release my quirk, and I pop back up to the surface. O's and ahs of awe filtered through the hole where they stood in. As Mirio explained his power, Midoriya stood with his hands on his chin as he digested the information. I guess it makes sense now why I couldn't smell him once he had vanished. Izuku's eyes widened at the thought and remembered the disturbing lack of clothes on Mirio as they had sparred. Did that mean that he had been naked behind those bins? Asui, who was standing only a little way from Midoriya who was still in shock, spoke up. That's really impressive, you were born with a really heroic and powerful quirk. Mirio quickly dismissed her words with a meaningless wave of the hand. You're wrong, it's taken me years to get to the stage I'm at now, and I had to really work my butt off. He began, but the training I've taken over the last few years at UA is finally starting to pay off, and soon, hopefully, I'll be able to say I've fully tamed my quirk. As the rest of his class walked forward and began asking their senpais questions, Izuku couldn't help but compare their quirk. One for all would have been far more difficult for him to control without the assistance of his Ghoul quirk. And the power he was unwillingly given, and the instinctual abilities which came with using his Kagyun, differed drastically compared from the quirk Mirio had, and yet Izuku realized that if he was to fully control and have power over his quirks, he would have to train just as hard as, if not more so, than Mirio. Even though the assistance he received and the food he was given for free was available now, Izuku knew that one day there would be a situation where it just wouldn't be, and he would need to train and prepare to fight the urges which came with his quirk, no matter how desperate he became. Izuku needed tame and have full control over his quirks if he was to become a hero, and just like Mirio, he would have to learn the ins and outs of his quirk, whilst discovering anything new or dangerous in the vast territory of unexplored abilities his Ghoul quirk could possibly possess. That was one thing he was going to have to ask Kaneki about. Once the lesson was concluded, Aizawa took Izuku back to the main office for a quick snack before his next class. Eating in the staff office had become the norm for Izuku, as he comfortably allied himself to relax in one of the sofas across the room from where Aizawa had set himself up for a nap in his sleeping bag. The black-haired hero watched Midoriya get to the last bite of his food before speaking up on something that had been troubling him, catching Midoriya by surprise as he was pulled from deep within his thoughts. Midoriya, I've been meaning to ask, have any of your classmates been giving you any trouble? Izuku blinked with surprise, looking up from the last bite of food he had with his mouth still open as he gave Aizawa a questioning look. Trouble? Izuku asked slowly, a little confused and nervous at the sudden question. Aizawa simply nodded. Trouble with your quirk. Izuku made a small O sound of understanding before hesitating to answer. Things had become far friendlier in the class ever since he had made up with Iida, but it hadn't prevented the hostility and fearsome of his other classmates, mainly Mineta, still held against him. He took the final chunk of his snack, awkwardly swallowing it, and the shame of being watched eating before he replied. When I got back to the dorms the first time, some of the people who had seen me during the summer camp were a little unsure and uneasy with my presence, which was completely understandable, to be honest. Izuku began calmly, looking towards Aizawa, but not quick reaching his eyes before a small smile made his way onto his face at slightly happier thoughts. But since then I've been able to work things out with the help of my friends, things are a lot better now than they were to start with. Admittedly, Izuku was brushing over the situation lightly, but compared to reactions and isolation he felt, Izuku was doing much better now. He didn't want to be the cause of getting anyone unnecessary in trouble for something his fault anyway. In some ways, Izuku couldn't help but feel a little annoyed at the late attempt of his teacher trying to assist him, but late was better than never. It seemed as though even if he was finally under the care of his teachers, there would always be problems they would never be able to solve for him. As Izuku became lost in thought again, Aizawa sat in silence as he thought over Izuku's answers, thinking back to the cold behavior he had undoubtedly noticed since the new term had begun. Ultimately deciding to wait and see if Midoriya would come to him for help first until he overheard the cruel whispers come from Mineta during the training. But now looking at Midoriya, Aizawa realized he'd left it a little late, knowing that the poor boy had managed to sort at least some of it out on his own already. He may be a teacher to hundreds of students every year, but social confrontations really weren't Aizawa's forte. He never claimed to be good at everything. Izawa stayed silent for a moment, watching Izuku fiddle with his hands as twisted slightly in his sleeping bag from where he was laying, shifting slightly so he could sit up properly as he let out a subtle sigh. "Alright, then." Izawa began, Midoriya awkwardly sitting opposite him. "If anything does happen, please come and speak to me. As irrational as it is, I can't assist you unless you come and speak with me first." Izuku quickly nodded as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, Izawa understanding the anxious need his students had to leave. Watching his hands, Izuku heard the sounds of his sensei getting out of his sleeping bag before rolling it up and stashing it away, walking back over towards him. Izawa knelt down in front of his students, his hand resting comfortingly on his students' shoulders before pulling away to rest them on his knees. "Keep your head up, Midoriya. I will always be here for your classmates and you, and I will do everything in my power to help you," Izawa began softly. "There is nothing you should have to be worrying about at the moment other than your studies. So just use the quirk you were born with and train hard. I know you have the will to become a true hero." Izuku looked up from his hands with a look of surprise, his jaw slightly slacked as he looked at his teacher's soft expression, the contagious look forcing a small smile onto Izuku's face. "Thank you, Izawa-sensei." Izawa's words had offhandedly reminded him of what All Might had told him during their meeting with Nezu, that all the other staff had been told that One for All was his birth quirk, just to keep some semblance of secrecy around him. Izawa only nodded in response, standing up straight again before sending Izuku on his way to his next class. Putting away the supplies, Izawa couldn't help but hide the twitch of a smile behind his scarf from the empty room before he reminded himself of comments made by Mineta. Izawa let out a deep sigh. Izuku was a good kid, far too good for his own good sometimes, but Izawa could only hope that Izuku would come to him next time things got tough. Finding a hero studies on one's own was difficult, Izuku had come to find as Gran Torino hung up the phone after encouraging him to ask All Might. He had been hoping to work with his old mentor instead of finding someone new and having to explain his situation to them, but it seemed as if that wouldn't be the case. Izuku had been a little hesitant to go to All Might for help, even if Izuku now trusted him with the majority of his problems, but in the end, it hadn't mattered as his mentor had spoken of an offer during one of Izuku's private lunches. "Sir Night-Eye?" Izuku listened with deep interest as All Might explained about the phone call he had received and the final meeting the staff had, discussing how they would handle the media revolving around the students. "Nothing has been fully put into place yet, my boy," All Might began drinking his cup of tea in his skinny form. "The staff finally came to a decision today during our morning meeting, but I thought I would tell you about the possibility now rather than later." Izuku nodded his head, hands on his chin, and he looked on, deep in thought. "Sir Night-Eye was your first and only real partner if you exclude David Shield, but as far as I'm aware you haven't worked together in a long time," Izuku mumbled to himself aloud out of habit, causing All Might to overhear his muttering. Yagi let out a sigh, lowering his tea slightly as he confirmed Izuku's thoughts. "You're quite right, young Midoriya, but it seems as if young Tagata mentioned you to him, most probably about the fight I heard you gave him a run for his money with." Izuku looked back up from his mutterings as All Might's words piqued his. "You mean, Mirio-senpai?" he asked aloud, causing Yagi to nod in response. "Young Tagata, as far as I'm aware, has been working with Night-Eye for the last year or so," All Might began, returning to his tea. "In fact, a short while after I met you, Night-Eye had put forward Tagata to me as a possible successor for One for All. I turned him down pretty quickly since I had already met you." Izuku sat back in his chair as he looked at Yagi full of shock, his jaw slackened slightly with surprise. It wasn't all that surprising. In retrospect, Mirio was fortunate enough to have been born with a very powerful quirk, giving him all the more reasons to become One for All's successor. However, the thought of how close Mirio had been to receiving the same quirk, which ultimately saved Izuku from a life of pain and suffering, was nerve-wracking. Shivering slightly at the thought, Izuku decided for a change of subject. "All Might, why did you and Sir Night-Eye stop partnering up for missions? If you don't mind me asking." Yagi shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the stop but replied nonetheless, letting out a tiresome sigh as he lowered his tea again. "After my battle with All for One 6 years ago, we had a disagreement about some things and decided to go our own separate ways." As All Might lifted his tea to his lips to finish off his drink, Izuku couldn't help but wonder how many bits of the story his mentor was decidedly choosing to leave out, almost as if his mentor was trying to hide something. "Oh, I see," Izuku replied quietly as their conversations drifted off into silence. At the end of Izuku's lunch break, All Might had handed him a small piece of paper. "This is Night Eye's contact details if you decide to go through with the work studies." All Might had begun, shifting awkwardly in his skinny form as he passed the note over to Izuku. "Just be careful, young Midoriya. Sometimes Night Eye can come on as a bit intimidating." Izuku could only wonder what All Might could have meant. Chapter 45. Sir Night Eye. The day had been full of hectic meetings and further introductions between Izuku, Mirio and his mentor, and at the end of the bothersome day, with the journalist creating an article about them, Izuku retired to his room to sort out the paperwork he would need to take to Night Eye's agency. Izuku's request for assistance in finding a hero study and the extra aid from Mirio, a meeting with Sir Night Eye, was finally offered and organized. Thankfully, because of Mirio's last year of participation in his own work studies and Sir Night Eye's agency track record, Izuku was given the approval he needed for the go-ahead from his school. Of course, unfortunately, there were several more details involved and meetings required to discuss the circumstances Izuku was under and the rules he was made to abide by. Midoriya had been certain that Sir Night Eye would be informed of his unusual situation the evening before their meeting, but surprisingly Izuku was yet to be informed of any last-minute cancellations. In some ways, Izuku was more afraid of what Sir Night Eye would say about his predicament than ever, thinking back to the brief words of caution All Might have offered him before his trip to Night Eye's agency, which kept playing over and over in his mind. When the morning of their formal introduction finally came around, Izuku was permitted to leave the premises of the UA grounds for the second time since he had returned from the police station without the multiple additional watchful eyes of the heroes. It was a sign of trust, a test, that Izuku was certain, and he had no intention of breaking it. All it took was an hour-long train ride, and soon both Izuku and Mirio were in the city Sir Night Eye's agency protected. Once Izuku and Mirio were signed in at the front desk, the pair made their way up to Sir Night Eye's office, where Izuku was faced with his first ultimate challenge. Unfortunately, it turned out it was far harder for Izuku to impress someone with his humor when it wasn't really his forte. He supposed it was difficult to try and create light-hearted jokes in the same place all of his dark memories were repressed. "What on earth are you doing to your face? Do you think it's funny? Ridiculing All Might like that?" Night Eye's first words to him left absolutely no doubt in his mind that he had ultimately ruined his first impression, the hero walking up to him before grabbing his face, causing Izuku to flinch back awkwardly. All these wrinkles and lines, all of them are in the wrong place. Even the off-licensed merch can do a better job than this, a pitiful excuse of an impression. Night Eye looked over his impression one last time before letting go of Izuku's face, Mirio standing just behind them with a wince on his face. Well, there was no coming back from that. Izuku rubbed his face in the spots where Night Eye had grabbed him. He quickly noticed the mountains of All Might merchandise which covered the room, far more than what even he had managed to collect, leaving his jaw hanging slightly open at the sight. It was then that his eyes caught onto the crowning jewel in the room, the All Might 10th anniversary poster that was never on sale. Holy cow, Izuku desperately wanted it. Izuku managed to tear his eyes from the post as he looked back at Night Eye walking away from him, eyeing him up. This man was a mega fanboy. The ultimate stan. "I don't have time to deal with people who find the mockery of All Might funny, you can lead yourself back to the entrance." Izuku felt his heart drop for a second before quickly standing his ground. "The Vinegar River incident, are you not aware of it, sir?" Sir Night Eye paused in his step, turning slowly back to face Izuku seemingly with a slight glare. The boy had a quirk which could turn water into vinegar and ended up almost drowning before All Might saved him. During the interviews, the boy had begun apologizing, but All Might had said that his skin felt 10 years younger. "It was before I worked with him, but yes, I know the story." Izuku let his face turn into a smiling beam as he fell into his fanboying phase. "Yes. That was the face I chose to make an impression on." Night Eye silently turned fully back to face him, concentrating on Izuku. "I see, so you were trying to test me then?" Izuku jumped back slightly with surprise, quickly denying the allegation. "Oh. No. With All Might working at UA, it's not very often that I get a chance to fanboy about him, that's all. A lot of people thought that interview was boring, but I've always found it really interesting," he said passionately, looking up to Night Eye just as Mirio walked back to talk to the sidekick trapped in the back of the room. I see." With that, Sir Night Eye walked over to his desk and sat down, Izuku standing on the other side, as the hero set both his sidekick, Izuku learned was named Bubble Girl and Mirio out of the room, leaving the pair alone in Night Eye's office. Night Eye had remained quiet for the most part, only asking for the few documents Izuku was carrying in his bag before taking them and breaking the silence to talk. "Once I stamp this piece of paper, you will be registered with my agency for your work studies for a minimum of 4 months. May I remind you that this will be nothing like the previous week-long internship you had, but before I even consider allowing you to join, I need to make something very clear to you." Night Eye pushed his glasses back up on his nose before folding his arms with a sense of distrust and doubt. "I don't believe you should have ever accepted All Might's power with your previous quirk. So tell me why I should let you do your work studies here." Izuku felt a wave of hostility and intimidation come over him from the hero sitting before him, silently taking Sir Night Eye's words. "When I received the call about you coming here to request your work studies, I was given some extra details I was informed I needed to know. To say I was shocked would be an understatement, and I'm surprised UA is even permitting you to participate in these, let alone the number of other heroes and police officers I'm sure are aware of your situation." In some ways, he was right. Izuku had known that for a very long time his choice of accepting one for all was done in a manner it never should have done, and he knew at the time he would one day have to deal with the consequences. Izuku just hadn't expected them to come in so many different forms. "I think the actions you took that day were irresponsible, and so were All Might's to some extent as well." Izuku gulped, frowning in disagreement against Night Eye's disapproval of All Might's choice. "I'm sorry, sir, but..." Night Eye was quick to interrupt him. "Saying sorry doesn't take back from the amount of havoc you have caused, whether you are seemingly working with the heroes now or not. All Might gave hope to the public with his power and humor. He used his abilities to bring safety and security, and used his name to bring peace. How can you do that with your quirks and the side effects they bring? So I'll ask you again, tell me why I should allow you to do your work studies here. What benefit will you bring me?" A deafening silence rang throughout the room as the hero sharply finished, leaving Izuku in a frozen, speechless state. What could he bring? How could he bring peace to the world, let alone Japan? Izuku knew if he started apologizing now, it would only make the confrontation worse between himself and Sir Night Eye. "I want to try. I want to become the #1 hero. And even if I can't because of my quirk and the fear I know it brings, I will protect everyone from the background and pick up the slack that others trying to fill All Might's space will bring. I know the responsibilities and dangers my quirk brings, but I will do anything to become the new symbol of peace, no matter what form it takes. I'm willing to shoulder that burden alone." The two watched each other silently as Isaacus's words rang through the air, Sir Night Eye slowly mulling over his words before creating a response. "The symbol All Might once was has already gone. Villainous activities have reached an all-time high, and the world is in desperate need of a new symbol of peace." Sir Night Eye began, "When I first heard of the villain name that had been branded upon your anonymous identity, the police had been calling in and giving details to as many heroes as they could for assistance. I did some of my own research in the aim of seeing if I could assist the case in any way." Izuku shifted on his feet, stuck still in his place as he listened intently to the information given to him and the details of his case which hadn't been made known to him. "You did a disturbingly good job in avoiding the police for so long, but in that time, in the area you once patrolled before you entered UA, I discovered you created fear amongst the villains that once lived in that area and unknowingly placed yourself at the top of the villains' hierarchy in the area." Izuku felt his eyes widen at the information, his jaw slowly slacking open in surprise as Night Eye continued talking. The hero spoke calmly, with far less hostility than before. "The criminals lived in fear of you and the danger you posed to them, and when I got the phone call about you, I looked up the villain activity in the area again. Ever since the Hosu incidents, your presence has dwindled away, and the villainous activity has returned, even doubled since All Might's retirement." The pro-hero shifted in his seat, folding his arms as he looked stoically towards Izuku. "Your actions in the past have twistedly backed up your words, but I won't allow you to use that strategy again, and I'm sure if you have any common sense you won't either. Your crimes from the past are a mark on your record, a point of distrust that people will one day discover and use against you, creating another void in the power that plays an important role in the stability of our society between heroes and villains." Izuku managed to gather the strength to speak. "I know that, but I'm working hard to pay back the debts I owe the people who have saved me and put me back on the right track, and to earn the forgiveness I know I will never obtain just by trying to do what is right. I know without my friends and my teachers at UA that I would be in prison, and that is where I should rightfully be because..." Isaacus's rambling was cut short as Sir Night-Eye hummed slowly in agreement, standing up from his chair as he held the stamp needed to get his work study approved. Fine, I see where you are coming from, but there is no point getting worked up over the past now. What happened has happened, you must learn to deal with the consequences and move on. Redeeming yourself can't just be a ramble of words either. Both factors are as important as each other. Sir Night-Eye began. All Might went to great lengths talking to me over the phone about your internal incessant need to prove yourself as worthy to others, or how he liked to put it, your ambition to become the new symbol of peace. Even though you don't have a drop of humor in you, I can see it now for myself as well, but you are going to have to work to earn your place here in this agency. I won't be going easy on you. Izuku felt his expression soften in surprise at the hero's partial agreement to let him join his agency before furrowing his brows seriously in deep concentration as Night-Eye finished talking, holding the stamp out in front of him for Izuku to grab. If you want to work here, you are going to have to stamp these papers yourself. Izuku eyed the situation cautiously, skeptical of the simplicity of it all. He just had to grab it? Slowly, Izuku reached out to grab the stamp in the hero's hand, only for Sir Night-Eye to sharply pull his hand to the side just as Izuku was about to touch it. You're going to have to try far harder to grab this, Midoriya. I suggest you use your quirks. Izuku felt his eyes widen in shock. Quirks? But sir, I didn't bring any extra food. Sir Night-Eye narrowed his eyes. And am I meant to be concerned about that? What happens in the real world when you are using your quirk and you risk your quirk getting the better of you? Are you just going to let the people who are hoping you save them perish into casualties? Izuku flinched back slightly at the hero's harsh words, flabbergasted. You have 3 minutes to try and take this from me. It's time to see those words put into action. Izuku's expression slacked slightly before scrunching into something far more engaged with the task at hand, putting his bag onto the floor as he put space between himself and Sir Night-Eye. Don't bother concerning yourself with what's in the room, just come and get it. The pair jumped back and forth between attacks continuously, Sir Night-Eye actively dodging Izuku's swinging arms at the stamp, while Izuku flung himself against and around the room in rapid succession. Izuku flung himself against one wall and shot himself back towards Sir Night-Eye, trying to outpace the reaction time the hero possessed, only for Night-Eye to dodge at the last second, catching Izuku before he had the chance. Izuku was starting to feel the strain on his mind as he forcefully held himself back to avoid the chance of his Ghoul quirk stamina from affecting his use of One for All, causing his switches and turns to become strained and inefficient. Didn't I tell you to use your quirks, Midoriya? Stop holding yourself back, you only have around 2 minutes left to grab the stamp, and time is ticking. Izuku narrowed his eyebrows angrily, jumping between another poster and a bookshelf like a ping-pong ball as he growled out an agitated response. You know I can't afford to risk that, this is my only chance to become a hero. Sir Night-Eye sighed with annoyance. Your inability to look past your own concerns has left you forgetting the finer details of what my quirk is. If I knew something was going to happen to you, I never would have continued this meeting past the first second. Izuku jumped up and forced himself to sprint back to where Night-Eye was standing, only to see him already standing to the side. You're going to pause to think about what I've said before realizing I've really seen what you are going to do after. Izuku gritted his teeth, standing off from the hero as he debated his options, cursing himself for even thinking about possibly using his Ghoul quirk against a hero. Soon after that, you're going to look around the room. There was no possible way for him to use his Kagyun, there was no point, and the energy it would require for him to use was dangerous. He hadn't even thought he would have been using his quirk at all today, how could he have known to have eaten more food? Was he even allowed to currently use his quirk off school grounds? And then, you are going to give him. Sir Night-Eye said, almost taunting him, as Izuku broke himself free from the restraints he had placed upon himself, flashing forward towards the hero, missing him by a hair. It's a pity, I thought you would have been able to get this stamp far quicker than this, even if you didn't have your Ghoul quirk, All Might choose wrong. What? Izuku called out cautiously. Sir Night-Eye watched Izuku closely, there were other candidates before you, Mirio should have been the one to inherit One for All. Izuku felt his gut drop in shock. Of course All Might had chosen him almost on a whim after the sludge incident, a gamble he suddenly took with no secondary opinions, of course, there had to have been other candidates. Do you really have time to sit aimlessly at this moment in time? My expectations for you were low after the phone call I received, but this is just a waste of my time. Even if you didn't have your other quirk, I don't believe you should have gotten One for All. There is a candidate that is far worthier, and I won't acknowledge it to you." Izuku felt the hero's words circling him like a shark, waiting for his response as Izuku was left trapped in the middle. He knew he wasn't worthy of one for all. He had known that ever since he had selfishly taken it to hide his own villainous identity, but as much as Izuku hated and despised himself for his past actions, he had worked hard to get to the point where he was. To fight not only his battles in real life, but the ones which raged on in his own pitiful mind to get to the spot of safety he was in now, and Izuku had never been able to do it alone. He had other people to work hard for, to impress and redeem himself to, and Izuku was not about to let himself get this far, only for All Might's former sidekick to drag him back through the mud he has so desperately called back out of. He couldn't afford to let him reject him now. He would have to move faster than Sir Night-Eye could react. Izuku shot himself around his room fueled with determination, flying everywhere as he flung from wall to wall like a bullet, leaving footprints all across the room. Thinking of ways to avoid the hero's line of sight, Night-Eye spoke out in disapproval. "Imitating Gran Torino, but nowhere near as fast as the original thing. You're going to have to try faster than that. You only have 30 seconds left." 30 seconds? It was the result of Izuku's quick action to formulate and put his plan into use, springing around the edge of the room as he reached for the bookcase with his hand, flinging the whole lot into the air. Papers and notebooks scattered the room, blocking Isaacus and simultaneously Sir Night-Eye's line of sight towards him, giving Izuku an opening. With a bounce he turned around and shot at the hero from a different angle, desperately wanting to reach out for the stamp as he lined up his trajectory, only to notice the limited time poster in his way. Oh, it was too rare, Izuku couldn't bring himself to damage it. With no time to stop, Izuku went slap bang into the wall, face first, leaving a trail of blood down the wall from his broken nose, which quickly crunched itself back into shape. If only the poster wasn't there. Izuku was sure he would have been able to have grabbed the stamp. The clock hit 0. "Your time is up." Sir Night-Eye's intimidating words rang out around the silent office as Izuku turned from the place he was kneeling on the floor with a look of despair and desperation on his face. "What no?" Izuku scampered back to try and convince the hero just as they continued talking. "It's too late, you have lost your chance to stamp these papers yourself." Izuku gritted his teeth with anger. "I was about to go into the 10th anniversary poster that wasn't for sale. I couldn't afford to damage it, and there wasn't enough time to avoid it." Slowly Night-Eye looked around the room to take in the damage at Isaacus's words, subconsciously noticing the footprint around the room which carefully missed and dodged all of the All Might memorabilia. The hero turned back to Izuku, who was looking desperately back at Night-Eye for his final answer. Izuku had kept his surroundings consolidated while managing to formulate and act upon his plan. Sir eyed Izuku thoughtfully, knowing he was clever from the length of time he had avoided the police, considering the amount of physical evidence found. But this small exercise had further proved his point. "Fine, I'll take you." Izuku left like he was getting severe whiplash. "What? Hello? Sir? Have you finished with Midoriya now?" That bang at the end sounded rather final. The green-haired student looked back between his senpai and the hero in shock, still trying to wrap his mind around Sir Night-Eye's words. Sir Night-Eye stood up straight as he turned back to face his student. "Yes, and I've decided to take him on as well." Izuku felt his jaw hit the floor as he managed to stutter out a confused response. What? B, but I didn't get the stamp," he declared, utterly confused, eyes wide. Sir Night-Eye turned to respond to him, his demeanor far calmer now than it was before. "I never said I wouldn't stamp the paperwork myself if you did not stamp the paper. I wasn't sure about taking you on considering your circumstances, but All Might convinced me to give you a shot, as much as I disapprove of his lack of consideration." Sir Night-Eye walked over to his desk, stamp in hand as he moved to mark the paperwork, Izuku scampering up off the floor to get close to the hero who had left his thought process in a stunning malfunction. Thank you, sir." Izuku rapidly spoke out, brimming with excitement as his dread had all but vanished. Sir Night-Eye sat down before clasping his hands, redirecting his attention towards Izuku with the paperwork in front of him, a sense of seriousness lowering in his voice as he spoke. "This world needs more heroes with the intellect and power to keep the world at peace, no matter which direction they decide to do it in." Night-Eye began, Izuku straightening up in his spot as he nodded dramatically, taking in the hero's words as he overcame the anxiety and fear he once had, the hero's words like law as he engraved them into his mind. Night-Eye's hand came down onto the paper, stamping it directly into the signature square. Welcome to the Night Eye Agency, I hope you won't disappoint me. Izuku beamed happily, nodding his head in excitement. I promise. I won't let you down. Chapter 46. The little girl named Eri. It was only a few days after Izuku got his paperwork signed that his work studies had already begun to turn and tumble downhill. The day was meant to be easy and organized, but Izuku wasn't prepared for the new kind of mental toll it would take on him. So, Midoriya, aren't you excited to finally have an official work-study spot? This all must be pretty new and interesting for you. Mirio declared happily, the pair of hero students walking down a street past groups of civilians as they did their first round of patrol together. Izuku nodded awkwardly as another group of people said hello to the pair of them, noticing their hero costumes and both their faces. Ah, I guess so. It's a little nerve-wracking though. I missed out on a lot of training I could have used as well. Mirio looked down at Izuku with a softer smile, understanding where he was coming from. I guess that makes sense, your class has been through a lot, and you've been in the public eye for more than just a sports festival. Izuku understood what Mirio was trying to hint at, avoiding people's curious eyes wandering over the pair of them as they walked through the streets. The sports festival had shown the world his friends and classmates and the skills they possessed. Along with that, his face, besides Bakugas, had been plastered all over the country during the time he had been held hostage with All for One. The massive media attention the League of Villains had brought him had stuck his class and him and Bakugo specifically under the spotlight, and now Izuku was faced with the fallout. At least all the civilians' words of awe and joy were kind, mixed in with the few of pity. At least they weren't cruel, and Izuku would forever be thankful that his presence as a ghoul during the summer camp hadn't been revealed to public knowledge. Yay, and I've never really been the best at social interaction, so this will be new, Izuku weakly joked, smiling awkwardly as he tried to bring light to the situation, Mirio chuckling in response. Don't worry too much about it. Mirio began, smiling brightly towards Izuku. You're here at your work studies to learn, aren't you? I'm sure we will be able to whip your social skills into shape in no time at all. Izuku looked up at Mirio, slightly surprised at his remark, before returning the enthusiastic smile. Right. Mirio hummed at Isaacus's response in approval before suddenly pausing, remembering something he was meant to ask. Oh, yay. I forgot to ask, since we are patrolling together, we should know each other's hero names. What's yours? Izuku blinked in surprise at the sudden question, but quickly agreed with a small grin on his face. Oh. My hero's name is Deku. Who? Like the doll? Izuku rubbed the back of his head as he grinned anxiously. Yay, it was a nickname my friend gave me when we were kids. I wasn't particularly fond of it, but one of my friends in my class said she thought it sounded a lot like Takeru, so I like it. Mirio made a small mouth movement as he finally understood the meaning behind his hero name. Awesome. I like it. Mirio grinned brightly, much to Izuku's delight. My hero name is Lemillion, after the number of people I want to save. He continued, his smile still beaming happily as he pointed to the number of his hero costume. I know I can't save them all, but I want to save as many people as possible. Izuku nodded enthusiastically in agreement, wanting to save as many people as possible himself. It was surreal to be finally patrolling the streets, allowed to walk around in public with the supervision of someone who knew. In some ways it's felt entirely wrong. Izuku thought back to what Night Eye said about Mirio once being a candidate for One for All, looking up at his senpai as he walked by his side. He could see it, the future hero that Mirio would be. He could see how well he could have taken up the mantle as the symbol of peace and how he still could. Izuku could only wonder what had happened between All Might and Sir Night Eye for his decision to fall elsewhere. It was only as their conversation continued that a small figure came running out towards the pair of them, bashing into Izuku's legs with a startle. Izuku flinched slightly at the sudden and unexpected contact, only to look down at the small child stumbling onto the floor. Izuku furrowed his brows worriedly, his mouth open with surprise as he knelt down to the child, quickly taking note of the stings of bandages wrapped all over the small kid's arms and legs. The terrified look on her face as he reached his arm towards her made Izuku pause his action. He knew this fear all too well. All too unsettlingly familiar. Hey, are you alright? Izuku called out worriedly to the girl, Mirio pausing from where he had walked on ahead to turn back to them. The girl didn't have a chance to respond to Izuku as a man appeared out of the alley the girl had come from, calling for her to come back. Come on, you wouldn't want to cause these heroes any problems, would you? The small girl flinched harshly at his words, her reaction reeking with terror as Izuku took that moment to look up at the stranger, only to freeze upon seeing him. The mask was identical, and his face a mirror image of the criminal both Night Eye and Bubble Girl were meant to be following today. Chisaki from the Shihasekai. I'm sorry about my daughter, she has a habit of running off on her own and bumping into things. Izuku could only look up at the man with fear written clearly on his face, eyes whitening, unable to say a word. What was this girl doing with a villain like him? Without a second thought, Mirio quickly took charge, flipping over Izuku's mask to hide how freaked out he was as he spoke. Whoa, your mask has fallen off again, you're gonna need that fixed. Mirio said cheerfully, his joyful persona not breaking at all as he looked back up directly to the villain. Sorry there. It was our fault too. That was right, Izuku gulped. He had to keep himself together, or he would end up breaking Sir Night Eye's entire plan. Chisaki continued on talking calmly, unnerving Izuku with the casualness of it all. You two are heroes? Aren't you? He asked, his mask subtly muffling his words. I don't think I've seen you two around here before, what agency are you from? Izuku sucked in a deep breath, looking up to Mirio out of the corner of his eye as he left the older blonde to take control of the situation. Mirio laughed awkwardly, we're still only students, we can't take our claim on an agency yet. We both still have a lot to learn. As Mirio deflected the question and the villain stood before them continued to listen, Izuku looked back down at the child now clinging desperately to him. The fear and terror wrote deeply into her expression as Izuku felt a wave of dread overcome him. They couldn't afford to let him know they were with Night Eye's agency. It was too much of a risk with the investigation going on. They wouldn't be able to take the child with them, they could take her back to safety. I suppose we ought to be going, Chisaki interrupted Mirio's explanation as he eyed the two heroes carefully, he was being cautious. They needed to leave. Mirio gave the villain a grin, nodding as he called out to Izuku. Right. We still have our patrol to finish, and we need to get back before lunchtime. Mirio declared, beckoning Izuku to follow him as he began to walk off. Oh, right. Izuku began in agreement, unwillingly moving to stand up and follow his senpai, just as the child clung to his leg and made a small noise, pulling herself closer. Izuku looked back down at the girl, stuck in the middle of a dilemma of what to do when he heard a small voice finally speak up to him. Pete, please. Please don't go. The girl's voice was wobbling all over the place, her tiny body shivering with fear as her small hands clenched tighter onto his leg. Tension in the air was starting to grow thicker as Chisaki called out to the girl again, asking her to follow him. Eri, it's time to go. Eri only clung to him tighter, not making a sound. Izuku looked back at the girl, placing his hand on her head as he tried to memorize the smells coming off her. Blood. It was faint, but there was fresh blood under her bandages. I'm sorry, sir, but your daughter seemed to be scared. What are these bandages for? Mirio stood to the side, internally pleading for Izuku to follow him, as Chisaki furrowed his brows at his suspicious intent. As I said, Eri is a very clumsy girl. She's probably scared of getting in trouble for running off just now. Parenting, it sounds rough, am I right? Mirio butted in trying to defuse the situation only for Izuku to ignore him. That doesn't explain what you're doing to her. Chisaki narrowed his eyes intimidatingly before looking at the two interns with an odd expression. It seems you got me, I don't really want to explain my family business outside, so maybe I can explain it somewhere more quietly. The two hero students looked at each other cautiously before following him back into the alleyway as Chisaki began explaining Eris's behavior, Izuku still holding Eri protectively to his chest. The alleyway was cold and dark, the buildings leaving a narrow space for them to walk down with no light able to pass through, leaving the end of the corridor looking as if it led into a void. Recently, she's been getting all defiant. Always running off like that, I think she's going through a phase. Chisaki shifted his arms as they walked, and out the corner of Isaacus's eye, he caught the subtle movement of his hand reaching into his other glove, the action making Izuku hesitate to walk forward. This was wrong. It seemed as if Eri had spotted movement too, as the second Izuku paused, Eri froze in his arms before struggling out of his grip. Hey Eri. Are you going to be okay? Isaacus's stuttered words were left unanswered, as to his dismay the girl ran back to Chisaki, Eri, not daring to lift her head as she walked alongside him. So you're finally finished with your temper tantrum, are you? Chisaki began, looking down at her sudden appearance beside him, walking away as he ignored Isaacus's words as well. Good, now it's time to go home. Izuku felt his jaw open to call out to Eri again, trying to move forward towards her only for Mirio to place his hand on his shoulder, pausing by his side. He was about to get violent, Mirio muttered almost silently, eyeing the shadows walking away from them. We can't follow him. Let's just get back to Sir and give him the details. Izuku looked back away from Mirio as he felt his heart break and ache painfully as he nodded sadly in agreement, watching Eri run after the villain in her bare feet as Chisaki stalked away into the darkness. Right, okay. As the pair of heroes left, Eris's figure finally disappearing out of the corner of Izuku's eye, he could only be left wondering, what the hell was he doing to her? He grimaced harshly at the thought, Izuku taking another deep breath from the air, settling his nerves, while taking the pair's smell down to memory. It was the least he could do, and now with Chisaki's scent as well, he would be able to trace them. Izuku now knew what it was like to be held hostage, the memories sending shivers of dread down his spine. He wouldn't allow what happened to him to continue for her. Izuku would save her, no matter what it took, even if the heroes couldn't find her again. It wouldn't matter, because now Izuku knew he could on his own if necessary, no matter how long it would take. Explaining what had happened to Night Eye was far quicker than Izuku expected. Mirio took the lead as he explained the incident in detail, mentioning the girl Eri and the mysterious bandages on her arm. Even though Izuku knew Mirio didn't know about his secondary quirk, he didn't hesitate to input his own finding as well, explaining the smells he had identified and memorized without directly naming them. Mirio was left confused about the sense Izuku had managed to memorize, not understand what Midoriya was saying, but Night Eye leveled Izuku with a look of understanding before giving him an appreciative nod. As the rain began to pour from the sky, the smell of Eri and Chisaki faded into the distance until it became untraceable, leaving Izuku clenching his fists with irritation and a sense of failure. There was no chance he would have been able to save her today, but with that small trail of evidence he could have followed fading away, it made Izuku feel utterly useless. He was just thankful ghouls never forget a scent overnight. I'm sorry, I should have used my quirk on you before you left, that was a lack of foresight on my behalf. I apologize. Izuku looked at Night Eye with a mixed look of horror and surprise, shocked by his lack of use of foresight on at least him specifically before they left on patrol. Izuku had entirely expected him to use his quirk before leaving them, surely that had to be one of the conditions he had to follow for Izuku to intern at his agency? The conversation continued on as Izuku stayed silent, still taking in the shock from learning the risk Night Eye had taken, horrified and slightly discussing his lack of care. Izuku just couldn't understand why Sir didn't use his quirk on him, surely if he ran away, or if he was to attack someone, both he and Night Eye would get into serious trouble. The thought alone was enough to make Izuku freak out. The walk back to Sir Agency was short, both Mirio and Izuku changing back into their UA uniform to go back to their dorms when Izuku decided to hang back a bit to talk to Night Eye. Midoriya? Aren't you coming? We need to get to the train station soon. Mirio called out to him from the other side of the room as Izuku began making his way to Night Eye's office. Izuku turned to look at Mirio and offered him an apologetic smile. Sorry. I just need to talk to Sir quickly. I'll catch up with you soon, don't worry. Mirio gave Izuku an oddly surprised look before smiling with a nod, leaving him in the corridor before Night Eye's office. Izuku took a deep breath before knocking onto the door, walking in as he heard Night Eye let him in. You wanted to ask me something? Midoriya? Sir began, busy looking at some papers on his desk as he looked at Izuku through the top of his glasses. Izuku nodded, a small frown forming on his face as he spoke, his voice getting a little more frantic the further he went along. I wanted to ask you about not using your quirk on me before I went out on patrol. I thought that was part of the agreement of my internship, or at least to have someone watching me who knew while I was in public. Night Eye put down his papers and looked at Izuku with an unimpressed glare before sighing as he understood Izuku's point of view. What I told you and Mirio after your patrol was a lie, at least only with you before you left, Night Eye began smoothly. I did use my quirk on you for safety reasons as written in the guidelines of your internship. But I couldn't have stopped you from going even if I saw what I did, because then what I would have seen would have been different. Night Eye clasped his hands together. My quirk allows me to see into a future which has already been set. I can't change the future which has already been written. He declared calmly, "If I had come along with you, there was no possibility things could have gone as smoothly as it did, especially in a civilian area. It was a risk I couldn't take." Izuku nodded his head a little shakily, utterly relieved that Night Eye hadn't risked his internship or his freedom in general. Izuku didn't quite realize how stressed he had made himself from the situation until the misunderstanding was settled. At least now he understood what had happened and Sir's reasoning. Still, I didn't help settle Isaacus's now heightened nerves of being allowed in public on his own. His growing anxiety that had been building since his interview with Night Eye a few days ago, finally getting the better of him, scared after the accident that something else would go wrong. "Ah, alright, that makes sense. Thank you," Izuku began, fiddling slightly with his bag, and he carried on, "But surely I still need to be watched? Let alone beginning led around on my own? That's something that would jeopardize his future, and the heroes wouldn't wait a second to have him trapped back down somewhere he wouldn't even be able to breathe." Izuku had finally started to feel better about himself, and the thought of being trapped again, under the constant eye of someone else or worse locked in a cell, left him in utter dread. Izuku couldn't bring himself to think about it, at all the possibilities of what would happen to him. He couldn't cope with the idea alone. Night Eye raised an eyebrow. "The rules the school has laid out for you aren't going to help you in the future when you'll be working on your own. When working here, I will be using my quirk on you mostly for your own safety and to keep the people in charge of your case appeased. Other than that, I have no intention of following you around like a sheep," he stated bluntly, causing Izuku to blink in surprise. But Izuku cut himself off, unable to understand why Night Eye was so willing to let Izuku patrol with Mirio as he pleased. Night Eye levels Izuku with an unimpressed look, the glare his eyes were sending intimidating Izuku. "Are you trying to tell me you are going to do something unwarranted?" Izuku recoiled at the questions, jaw dropped in horror as he quickly dismissed the idea. "What? No." Izuku could almost say he thought he saw Night Eye's frown twitch slightly into something akin to a smirk before the hero nodded. "Good, I'm glad to hear it," he began dully, his expression dropping as he returned to his papers, pausing as he spoke again. "I wouldn't have taken you on if I thought you were going to be a flight risk, Midoriya. Besides, even if I were to accompany you on your patrols and you were to go rogue, Mirio would have a much better chance of subduing you than me considering his quirk. My quirk allows me to predict people's actions, but against the power and stamina you hold, assuming you were going all out, I would struggle to win." Izuku looked at Night Eye gobsmacked, so surprised he wasn't even sure if he was hearing correctly. He wasn't even sure if Night Eye was complimenting him. Night Eye grabbed some of his papers and filed them away before looking at Izuku again. "Don't get me wrong, I'm merely stating what should be the obvious, but there is no need for you to worry about something going wrong on your patrol again, even if there is a case where I am unable to use my quirk on you before you leave and you are pushed beyond your normal limits. Don't get me wrong, I'm not encouraging you to actively use your other quirk, but as long as there is an acceptable reason, such as saving another life, I shall vouch for you." Izuku's shocked expression morphed into a frown at Night Eye's last comment. "You don't need to worry, I have no intention of ever using that quirk again. I'm not risking all the work my friends and my senseis have put into keeping me safe." Night Eye eyed Izuku carefully. "In that case you will be wasting your full potential." Izuku could help but gape, flabbergasted, at the hero with utter confusion written on his face. What was with the mixed signals? The green-haired boy stayed silent as Night Eye let out a deep breath, standing up tall from his office chair as he walked to stand a little ways off from Izuku. "You need to talk to someone about your anxiety when it comes to patrolling alone," Midoriya. Night Eye began bluntly, his voice strong and serious as he emphasized his words. "Beyond that, you need to take into consideration that if you ever do make it to becoming a full-time pro, there will be times where you have to work alone. People will be left to rely on you to save them, and you will need to be able to trust your own abilities to get the job done with zero casualties." Izuku remained silent as he took in the depth Night Eye's words as the hero carried on. "As much as it displeases me, Midoriya, you have possibly the most powerful quirk in the world. You need people to be on your side, you need people to trust and believe in you, but before that you need to be able to trust yourself. At the moment it's going to be hard for you to do so, but you need to learn to what extent your quirks can do, in a safe and secure manner, and trust your ability to do what's right." Night Eye lifted his head as he eyed Izuku calculatingly. "If someone was in trouble and needed saving, you wouldn't hesitate, would you?" The emphasis on hesitation made it all too clear what Night Eye was indicating. Using his ghoul quirk had always been out of the question when he thought about his heroics and the lives he would save in the future, but in reality, now that he thought about it, hadn't already used his ghoul quirk to save loads of lives whilst taking them as well? The Uraraka at the USJ, Todoroki and Iida at Hosu, and Koda and his classmates during the summer camp. Bakugo whilst faced with All for One. Izuku paused, coming to a deep realization. Hadn't most of those people he had killed before been at least partly because he was trying to save someone? As messed up as it was? No. No, of course not. Night Eye gave Izuku a strong nod of approval as he heard the conviction his words carried. Good, well I hope to see some improvement to your views of patrolling next time you are here. Hey Midoriya. What took you so long? After his meeting with Night Eye, both Izuku and Mirio jumped on the next train back to Musatafu before walking back to UA alone. Midoriya had honestly suspected one of their teachers to come and collect them from the station, but the walk to their new home with Mirio was more than appreciated, but it gave him the chance to put the piece of the puzzle in his mind back together. Over the coming days, Isaacus's frustration only got worse, and it wouldn't allow him to concentrate on his work and studies. Why hadn't All Might told him about Mirio? Why didn't he warn him properly that Night Eye would be so disapproving of him, even without mentioning his ghoul quirk? His classmates reminding him of what happened at his work studies didn't help much either. It was utterly surprising how allowing Night Eye was with him, considering his past and other quirks. But at least it allowed Izuku to realize the distaste towards him holding One for All wasn't a personal grudge against him, but the thought put Izuku deep in thought. What had happened between All Might and Sir Night Eye? What had ended their team together? Why hadn't All Might told him Mirio was meant to have taken One for All? Izuku needed some answers. It wasn't fair on him to be kept out of the secret being kept around him. If he wanted to sort out his own problems, this was a start. He needed to be aware. It took a little while to find All Might, his mentor unable to teach heroics so often, whilst still recovering from his wounds from All for One. Eventually, after getting nowhere asking his teachers, Izuku resorted to using his quirks to hunt the hero down on his own. Even with the vast area of the school grounds, on the dry sunny afternoon, it only took a second to find him. Izuku found the retired hero running down the many roads leading between the training grounds, sprinting at full speed to his mentor. All Might. All Might. Izuku called out and made his way up the road, causing his mentor to jump and turn to look at his student's sudden presence. Whoa. Young Midoriya, how did you find me? Besides, I don't think you're allowed to use either of your quirks unless with an adult. Yagi scolded lightly with a confused look about him, wondering what his successor could want, while not really bothering to enforce the rule as he placed his trust in Izuku. I'm sorry. I was able to sniff you out, sorry that sounds weird, I was just trying to find you. Izuku puffed a little, catching his breath as he apologized, while All Might remembered his abilities before quickly shooting his questions to his mentor. I needed to ask you what happened between you and Night Eye. Why didn't you warn me about what I was walking into? Night Eye knows about One for All and wanted Tagada to have it, why didn't you tell me beforehand? All Might turned to look the way he was headed, too unsure and uncomfortable with the topic to look his student in the eye. It wasn't my place, say. Of course it was. Izuku butted in irritably, his expression visibly confused and strained. If it wasn't up to you, then who would? All Might stood silently, accepting Midoriya's words without complaint, whilst letting his successor vent. The fact his reaction to my other quirk was better than his reaction to learning, I had accepted One for All after receiving it, but that wasn't even the worst part. Do you realize what it was like? Walking into his office worried out of my mind because of how he might have reacted to my ghoul quirk, only to discover he had already rejected me for holding One for All, without even knowing why. Izuku clenched his fists tightly, nails digging into his hands. I need to know what happened between you and Night Eye. Not as your fan but as your successor. I know I never came to you about what happened to me and my quirks before, and I'm sorry for that, but it's not fair to keep secrets that involve my powers a secret from me. Yagi turned to look at Izuku from over his shoulder. I didn't think knowing this information would help you, he began. I didn't withhold it from you because you didn't tell me about what happened before the summer camp. I'm sorry if it came off that way. Yagi sighed deeply, the years taking their toll on him as he turned to his successor with a grim look. We worked together for 5 years before my first injury with All for One, but it turned out we had different values. Izuku straightened himself out as he nodded understandingly, lowering his head slightly as he went into deep thought. I remember you'd never had a sidekick before him, and the reason why you split up was kept out of the media." Yagi nodded in affirmation. "That's right," he began, a little softer than before. "After my injury we had an argument. Night Eye wanted me to retire with the fame to keep my symbol of peace a legend and pass on my quirk to the next symbol, but I didn't want someone to take all for one's place in the underworld whilst raising the next symbol. I wanted to continue my hero work and continue to save people for as long as possible." All Might sighed deeply again. "It turned out Night Eye had used his quirk on me. He tried to warn me not to carry on, but I didn't listen, and not long after we parted ways. It was a few years after Nezu recommended young Tagada to me, but before I had a chance to meet him, I met you." And just as All Might's words left his mouth, Izuku felt a wave of dread and realization come over him, remembering how Night Eye had explained his quirk only a few days ago. It was then that it truly hit him. Death. As All Might turned to look and run the other way, Izuku was yet again reminded about the deaths which seemed to trail behind him, and the deaths of those close to him yet to come. He had never really thought about it that way before. All the deaths he had faced in the past were ones of his own hands, but now he was faced with a new reality. Had Night Eye really seen how All Might was going to die? Izuku had known that All Might had almost been killed before, and that the first after the summer camp had put an end to his hero work, but to remember Night Eye's quirk and the confirmation it brought. He had known that the trail of misfortune that followed him was going to catch up to him again, but Izuku hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. What had Night Eye's reaction been when All Might had told him he was passing it on to someone else like before? Izuku yelled out to his mentor. "Wait! All Might!" Yagi paused in his running as he turned back around to see Midoriya chasing after him. "All Might, how far into the future was Night Eye's vision? I need to know. Please." Yagi hesitated. 6 to 7 years. The further into the future Night Eye looks, the harder it is for him to know the time, but his foresight has never been wrong. Yagi continued, "Honestly, now I'm not sure when I'll die." Izuku gasped shakily, tears welling in his eyes. "But it could mean this year or the next." All Might nodded solemnly, remaining silent as Izuku wiped his tears. But you can't die yet. You said I needed to introduce myself to the world at the sports festival, and I failed then, but I can't do that yet either. I need your help." Izuku's voice wobbled out, tears slowly forming into streams down his face as his heart pounded painfully. "I need you to live. All Might, please. I need to help me become a hero so I can keep my end of the promise and show you that I'm here. Whether that's as a pro hero or someone fighting for the world in secret." All Might tilted his head slightly in confusion. Fighting for the world in secret? Izuku let his body slump as he nodded his head. "Night Eye made me realize that if I want to be the next symbol of peace, that I need to be able to put my all into saving people, and I can't do that without both my quirks. I need to learn how to use it and accept it properly as part of who I am, but I know that using it will become a double-edged sword. I know people will be scared of me and my powers, no matter how cautious I am with them." Isaacus's thoughts trailed to Eri and his friends and classmates, all of the people he had saved with his ghoulish powers, determination filling his gut to the brim. "I didn't choose to have my ghoul quirk, but if I want to save people to the best of my abilities, I will choose to save with it. It's like you said in that interview when I was a kid, any quirk can be heroic if you use it right." All Might looked at Izuku with a mixture of shock and awe, a grin forming on his face. "I thought during my last battle with All for One that it was going to be my end, but right at the very thick of the battle my thoughts trailed to you, Midoriya. I thought about how much trouble you have been through and how you have always kept on pushing forward." A grin formed on the former pro hero's face, the evening sun shining brightly around them as he looked at the surprised look on Midoriya's face. "So, kiddo, don't you worry. I have no intention of dying anytime soon. I want to see you continue to grow. I want to see how your powers progress. Night Eye's predictions have all been right so far, but I swear, I will do anything to protect you and help raise you into becoming our next symbol, whichever way you decide." Yagi joked lightly, "Hey, maybe I've already reshaped my future, who knows? But we can't be sure." Izuku let his brows furrow determinedly, clenching his fists again as he looked directly to All Might. "But whatever Night Eye saw, I refuse to let it. You helped me fight my fate after the summer camp, you saved me. So whatever happens to you I will always do my best to fight your fate. So you can keep on living too." Izuku watched the surprise on All Might's face as his own turned into a bright tearful smile. his cheeks hurting from the strain and his eyes slightly puffy from the tears. "So thank you, All Might. Thank you so much. I will do whatever I can to save you." As Izuku held out his fist to his number one hero, Yagi walked forward and bumped their fists together, smiling brightly back down at his successor. "I know you will, young Midoriya. I believe in you completely. Wait, All Might. Why don't you just ask Night Eye to use his quirk on you again?" "What? No. It's too awkward for me to see him at the moment." "That's okay. I'll bargain with him for you." "Young Midoriya, please wait. I don't think that's a good idea, and stop using your quirk, you'll get me in trouble as well." "Sorry, All Might." Chapter 47. Ghoul Quirks. The morning after Izuku spoke to All Might was one of the first free weekend days he had off in a long time. There was no training organized, no hero agency requesting his presence for the day, no friends in the dorms to hang out with. Normally he would have spent the day with Uraraka, but she was currently at her own internship, or Todoroki, who was at his provisional license lessons. He couldn't even hang out with Bakugo because even he was out alongside Todoroki, leaving Izuku utterly stuck as to what to do. Izuku let out a bored huff, laying on his bed with no rush to get up, as he wondered what to do with himself. As Izuku was left pondering, his thoughts wandered to his other classmates. Sure, he could hang out with the few of them left in the dorms today, but Izuku still wasn't fully comfortable being around them outside of school times. He let out a sigh. It was still awkward between him and the few classmates who knew about his powers but didn't know the story behind them. There would always been that tension which would arise, especially when they weren't concentration on becoming a hero. With that thought laying uncomfortably in his mind, Izuku's thoughts trailed to his internship, about Eri and the words Night Eye had discussed with him afterwards. In some ways, Night Eye's words reminded him of the explanation Mirio had when explained his quirk to his classmates. At the time, Izuku had only put it to thought about discovering the true depths of the power his ghoul quirk had, along with One for All, without putting any effort into doing so. This was different. Now Night Eye had practically encouraged its development, and well, Izuku had nothing better to do today. He still wasn't sure if he was allowed to leave UA unless it was for his internship without permission, so Izuku realized his best bet was to ask Aizawa for permission first. It didn't take long for Izuku to walk down the stairs to the ground floor of the dorms before heading towards the basement where Aizawa's in-building office resided. It wasn't actually a dorm room itself, but Izuku knew Aizawa human scent well enough to know his sensei was just beyond the door. With a small double knock on the door before calling out his name, it only a second for Aizawa to reply and the door to open with a tired expression on his face, still comfortable wrapped up in his sleeping bag. Izuku assumed his sensei had stayed the night in the dorms again. It wasn't the first time, considering Izuku's personal situation, and it certainly wasn't going to the last. "Midoriya? What's wrong?" Izuku jumped a little as he heard Aizawa's subtle words of concern, subconsciously rubbing the back of his head as he grinned awkwardly. "Oh, I was just wondering if it would be possible for me to leave campus to see one of my friends. I know the others just sign out using their ID, but I wasn't sure if I'm allowed out yet, unless it was for my internship without supervision." Aizawa seemed to relax at his words, seemingly expecting Izuku to come to him for something far more worrying, when he nodded his head up with understanding, turning back into his office as he beckoned Izuku to follow him. "I have nothing personally against you leaving the school grounds to do whatever you teenagers do without getting in trouble, but unfortunately you would still have to be supervised, and the paperwork involved would take a lot of time to go through before getting Principal Nisa's approval." Aizawa began, Izuku deflating sadly at his word. "Ah. I see," he said disappointingly as Aizawa made it to his computer and sat down. "That being said, Midoriya," Aizawa continued before Izuku had a chance to leave the room, "it would be far easier to get them permission to enter UA, considering they don't have a previous criminal record." Izuku perked up at his sensei's words. "As far as I'm aware, they don't have one," he quickly replied, leaving Aizawa nodding in approval. "Good, I'll have to check on the police database, but I can get them a visitor badge by lunchtime. Usually we don't let students do this with friends, otherwise the school would be packed with civilians and the amount of paperwork would be unreasonable, so don't tell any of your classmates about it. Okay?" Izuku nodded with a smile, quickly giving both Hyde's and Kaneka's names for their respective paperwork before quickly sending them both a text. It didn't take long for Hyde to respond, but unfortunately his arm was in the process of regrowing from a recent meal, but was quick to get an answer from Kaneki himself, who agreed to come over. Hyde's already had his visitor badge and background check done, Midoriya, so he can come whenever he likes. Aizawa commented, still looking at his computer screen as Izuku was busy looking at his phone. Ah, that's good, he's just said that he couldn't come today though. Kaneki said he's still available though. Aizawa momentarily looked over his shoulder before silently giving his student a quick nod before getting back to work. Izuku looked up from his phone silently before a small unseen smile grew on his face as he stood behind his teacher, feeling utterly grateful for the favor he was going for him for free. It felt odd, Izuku couldn't honestly remember the last time a teacher before the staff at UA had actively tried to help him, even for the smallest of things. It left him feeling a little bitter and solemn inside, the amount of hate he used to get for being quirkless, and now even with a ghoul quirk, he was more accepted than back then. With a hesitant sigh the thought pushed from his mind, Izuku promised he would find a way to thank his sensei for everything he had done for him, one way or another. That should be all the paperwork, Aizawa began, sending it off to his printer. Just remind your friend to bring his ID with him at the entrance so I can double check over some things. Sometimes data on these files don't get updated as often as they should do. Especially for people without criminal records. Izuku nodded enthusiastically before asking his teacher a question. What gets changed that wouldn't be in the files? He asked curiously. Aizawa, who had stood up to grab the paper from his printer, spoke without looking away. Only small insignificant things such as quirk names and a more up-to-date photo of the holder. It's mostly for confirming their identity if anything, and registering his official quirk name into the school logs. Izuku paused in his thoughts, eyes whitening slightly at his teacher's words. He didn't know what quirk was on Kaneka's ID, let alone why the school would need it. Why does it matter what quirk visitors have? Izuku asked cautiously, looking up at his sensei who had turned to look at him at the question. Aizawa paused before carefully replying. It's not to hold anything against the person's quirk, it's just a record for safety purposes that Nezu enforced after the USJ attack. Aizawa hesitated before continuing, if it's any cause for concern, we opted not to put your other quirks in consideration for you, just in case it were to get leaked. The only people who know about your other quirk are the UA staff, the staff and heroes on your case, as well as any friends who know. Well, it would be a bit of a stretch to call Mineta a friend, but Izuku got the idea. The green-haired boy with the few white patches still sticking through nodded his head silently. Ah, that makes sense. The room their pair of them stood in fell into an awkward silence between them, only the sounds of them breathing, and Aizawa filling in a few details on the paperwork and pen filling the air. It was only as Aizawa put down his pen did he break the awkward silence. So how did you and this friend of yours meet? Izuku blinked in surprise at the question, hesitating to answer as he thought up a plausible explanation. It may seem like an interrogation question to some, but Izuku was far too used to his teacher to recognize the surprising genuineness behind Aizawa's question. Oh, we met at Hero Convention at an All Might trivia quiz. He was only a few points behind me, and afterwards he came to speak to me, and we just never lost contact. It was a blatant lie, but as much as Izuku wanted to trust Aizawa with his secrets, it was not his place to tell Kaneka's own personal secret. Izuku knew he had gotten incredibly lucky with how his own treatment had turned out after his identity had been discovered, especially considering the new public knowledge on ghoul quirks he had revived. Izuku had been thrown into the horrific world all alone, but Kaneki had always kept under the radar perfectly over the course of his life, actively avoiding any suspicion with the skills and knowledge he had to last over a lifetime that he had learned himself or from others. And while Kaneki's activities had never been publicly reported, there was no chance that he would get away as lightly as Izuku did. Besides, if anything, it would surprise people more to tell them he had never been to one, even with all his personal merchandise. Oh, the joys of growing up without friends. Aizawa turned to give Izuku a blank expression, almost able to hear the really coming from his sensei's thoughts, as Isaacus rubbed the back of his head sheepishly smiling. Aizawa let out a tiresome sigh. Right. In that case, I better deliver these papers to Nezu, his sensei stated, beckoning Izuku to follow him as they walked out of the room and up the stairs to the main room. It was only as they both walked past the front doors that Aizawa paused to quickly ask Izuku another question. Midoriya, another thing. Do you need anything for when Kaneki comes? Or anything additional or quirk requirement to make considerations for before he arrives? Izuku slowly paused in thought, caught a little surprised by the question, before slowly shaking his head. No, not as far as I know. The truth about Kanekis's quirk was something that Izuku would swear to keep secret until the day he died, no matter how much trouble he would get in if he was caught. Kaneki saved Izuku from the murderous path he was forced to walk and was the sole reason he was able to go a full 2 months without murdering anyone, and for that Izuku would trust him. That being said, Izuku didn't even know what Kanekis's quirk was classified as on his ID, so it was better to keep his mouth shut anyway. Izawa gave Izuku a confirming nod before turning to leave the room. "All right, the paperwork should be done within the next half an hour, but I'll let you know anyway." With that, Izawa left the building. A few hours later, Kaneki arrived at UA with a small smile on his face as Izawa took Izuku to meet him. Double-checking over IDs before handing Kaneki his visitor's badge, Izawa let the pair of them go back to the dorms where Izuku quickly led Kaneki up to his room to avoid the possible noisy classmates that could have been lurking around. When they got to his room, Izuku closed the door behind them with a sigh of relief before turning back to face Kaneki, who was looking around his room at the piles of All Might memorabilia which plastered the walls. "I'm glad you messaged me when you did about the ID. I was about to leave my house without going somewhere else before you asked me over, although I'm surprised they let me into this school so easily, especially with all the attacks over the last year." Izuku let out a tired sigh as he slumped down onto his bed, resting on his arms leaning behind him. "Yeah. Normally people can't get into this place so easily, but Izawa-sensei offered to do me a favor since I'm not allowed off the school grounds unless it's for my internship." Kaneki turned to face Izuku with a raised eyebrow, a little confused at the odd ruling. "That's a weird rule. Do you make your way to your internship unsupervised?" Izuku shrugged before nodding. "Yay, I think it may be because I go there with another upperclassman, but I agree, it doesn't really make any sense." Izuku let out a sigh as he let his arms give away as he flopped his back onto his bed. "It keeps them happy, whoever they may be. I'm just glad not to be in Tartarus or something." Kaneki visibly cringed where he stood, awkwardly looking away to one of Isaacus's figures as he nodded in agreement. A calming silence was shared between them for a moment, Midoriya resting his head under his arms as he allowed himself to relax. The midday sunshine brightly out the window with a breeze Izuku could only imagine was refreshing in the early autumn sky behind his locked balcony window. Izuku subtly shifted his head as he looked back over to where Kaneki was gazing over some of his notebooks, allowing his mind to wander when he suddenly realized that this was the first time he had seen Kaneki since before summer camp, a little over a month ago. The thought took Izuku by surprise. So much had happened in such a short amount of time, so many new rules and living conditions had changed that Izuku really hadn't had the time to adjust back and link his past routine with his present. Sure, he was certain that Hyde had spoken to Kaneki, that Kaneki had told him that he was okay, but it was comforting to talk to him in person again. It must have been uncomfortable and worrying, watching the story unravel on the news without hearing a word from him, until Hyde was called into the school, and to be honest, Izuku wondered if it had been the same with the rest of his friends. He assumed so, he hoped so. Besides, Izuku was alright now, he was in safe hands, and he was sure to let his friends know he was okay. "I've got a lot of the teachers here at UA who are surprisingly willing to help me, so I'm in good hands. I won't be going to prison anytime soon." Kaneki turned back to Izuku with a weary smile, Izuku grinning sheepishly back before speaking out again. "That being said, I was meaning to ask you something," he began, sitting up on his bed as Kaneki turned to him with his full attention. "I was wondering what your quirk is? On your ID, I mean," Izuku reiterated. Kaneki blinked with surprise before he smiled and reached back into his pocket to pull out his ID, passing it freely as Izuku took a look. "Nose detector." Huh, that was something Izuku wasn't really expecting. Izuku raised an eyebrow in surprise before handing Kaneki his ID back. "Nose detector?" Kaneki laughed awkwardly as he reached up to scratch his cheek. "My mum didn't want me to be written down as quirkless, that's something at least I can be thankful for before she died. I'm sure you can figure out why." Izuku stayed silent as he nodded in agreement, deep in thought. He could understand more than anyone why his mother would have done such a thing, but a nose detector was an odd choice. Even so, with a quirk such as their own, Izuku could see why it was a viable option. It was definitely something they could both have proved, either way. "So what did you want to do anyway?" Kaneki began, switching the topics with a smile. "How's it going for your hero course?" Izuku happy moves with the conversation, returning Kaneka's smile. "It's been pretty good. I've recently started working in an internship at Sir Night-Eye's agency." Izuku's smile dims. Last time I was there I went out on patrol with my upperclassmen. I can't give out many details about it, but Izuku paused before sighing, grimacing all the while. We came across a girl who we later found out had run away from the villain the agency was tracking. Kaneki visibly grimaced as well. Oh, that's awful. Izuku nodded in response before putting on a smile as he answered Kaneka's other question. It's actually why I was wondering if you could help me with something. I couldn't ask over text or call just in case someone was listening. Kaneki looked at him with visible curiosity. Oh, what was it you needed? Izuku sheepishly scratched the back of his head. I was wondering if you could help me learn more about my quirk and what I can do with it. Izuku sighed as he lowered his hand. The thing is, I'm not allowed to use it or go anywhere to train without supervision now, so I thought I'd ask you. Kaneki blinked in surprise, straightening himself up a little as he replied, well, I don't know that much, only what my mother told me. He lifted his hand up to his chin, deep in thought. That being said, she was friends with a few others when I was younger, although we lost contact after she died. Either way, I'll see what I can find for you. Izuku smiled gratefully, bowing his head in appreciation. That would be great, thank you. You'd have to send anything you find to Uraraka's phone number. Thought. I still don't know if anyone's watching my messages. Kaneki nodded understandingly with a warm smile. It's better to be safe than sorry. The pair worked together over the course of the day to research whatever they could find, the sun reaching its highest point in the air before slowly falling down to the skyline until Izawa came to inform them that Kaneka's times was up for the day. Izawa left the pair in the room as Kaneki packed up his stuff, the pair walking down to the main exit not long after. Thankfully it was only Bakugo who saw them on their way out, the boy looking at them curiously at them as they made their way out of the building. On the stairs, Kaneki turned to face Izuku behind him as he walked down in front. I'll try and do some more research for you in my own time. I'll see if I can't track down my mum's friends too, but try not to tell Hyde though. Kaneki began, a small sneaking smile partly hidden under the darkness from the evening sky, which Izuku easily returned. Kaneka's grin fell into a heartwarming smile at Isaac's response, glad his friend was happy and safe, before letting it drop as he paused to ask him something. Hey, there was something I was just wondering about. Since UA asked to see my ID, I was wondering if they ever questioned you about hides? Izuku tilted his head in confusion, furrowing his brows as he paused in thought. They had asked where I had gotten my food from during the months before the summer camp, but they never about Hyde's quirk. Why do you ask? Kaneki visibly hesitated before he replied, seemingly sifting thought his options. Legally, Hyde's still quirkless. He never got his quirk registered after the accident to prevent people asking questions. Kaneki slowly began. I just thought it was odd that he managed to get in without getting interrogated. He never mentioned anything, but if they have conducted the same background checks they did with me, surely they would have realized something was off. Izuku paused at the thought, eyes slowly widening at Kaneka's reasoning. It made sense. In theory, Hyde should have had to have gone thought the same checks as well. Kaneki let out a sigh and just shrugged his shoulders. I just find it a little odd they didn't ask questions, but if they never brought it up, it's probably nothing to worry about. But it was Izuku had known from the start that his cover stories were never perfect, that the plot holes had always left hints for them to follow, but he'd never expected to have to worry about that after he had been caught, let alone for the sake of someone else's life. Izuku knew better than anyone that Nezu wasn't one to miss things, that he was always trying to get one step ahead, and that wasn't something he hadn't accounted for. Izuku wasn't called back to his internships until the end of the week, so his days pasted plainly by. Kaneki hadn't found much either, but Izuku was still glad for the help. The night before he was called back in, Uraraka had dragged him into the kitchen whilst having a conversation with Tsu about their shared internships. It was interesting to learn what Uraraka's experiences with Ryukyu were like before discussing the parts of his own internship where he could. It came as a surprise when Izawa came up to the three of them and told him that he'd be traveling to Sir's agency as well. So when his time to return to Night Eye's agency came, it didn't come as a shock when Asui, Uraraka and even Kirishima started walking in the same direction as them, riding the same train before getting off at the same stop. It became abundantly clear where they were all headed as they caught Mirio and his two friends only a few blocks short of Night Eye's agency. Something was happening, and Izuku wasn't entirely sure what. The short conversations between Kirishima and himself didn't settle his nerves either. It was around 10 a.m. when Izuku, his classmates, and Aizawa finally made it to the agency, the crowd of heroes in the main foyer, filled with no-named pros, and the odd few ranking in the top 100 that Izuku recognized as he peered around the room. Whatever was going on, it was big deal. The meeting hadn't started yet, there was nothing to do. Izuku was spending his time trying to identify all the heroes around the room, stood beside his friends as conversations filtered thought the air. Only just noticing one of the heroes he didn't know staring at him with a disapproving glare from across the room. Unsure why the random hero was glaring at Izuku, slowly he turned around to see if there was anyone behind him, before looking back and walking over to the other side of his friends where Aizawa was standing. Nope, they were definitely glaring at him. Izuku swallowed nervously as he pulled his eyes away from the hero, Aizawa noticing his new presence beside him as his sensei looked over to where he had just been looking. It only took a single look from his teacher before Izuku heard the sigh of displeasure coming from his mouth. "Oh, it's him." Aizawa began with a tone of annoyance, leaning down slightly to inconspicuously whisper to Izuku, "Don't pay him much attention, Midoriya. He's looking this way because he was part of your investigation. He's here because he recently relocated agencies. If he bothers you at all, let me know, alright?" Izuku slowly nodded. Ah, that made sense, that hero knew who he was. Well, that wasn't awkward and off-putting at all. Thankfully, the meeting started not long after, with Bubble Girl walking into the foyer before calling them into the room and explaining the situation. "Thank you all for coming at such short notice," Bubble Girl had began, apologetically before continuing. "The agency has called you here today to discuss the Yakuza group, Shiha Seikai, and the criminal activities we believe they are participating in." Izuku watched silently along with the rest of the room in anticipation as a photo appeared on the screen at the front of the room, showing a group of men in handcuffs. Bubble Girl continued her discussion. "About a year ago, we started our investigation after a bank robbery resulted in an altercation between the Yakuza and the criminal committing the heist. At first the police thought it an accident, as the criminals involved with the robbery were left unharmed, but there was a few things which didn't add up, so we began to investigate their trail." The screen switched to an image of Chisaki, Overhaul, wearing his creepy mask that left Izuku feeling uneasy as Centipeder took over the discussion. "During our investigation, we discovered that one of the members of the Yakuza group, Kai Chisaki, otherwise known as Overhaul, had begun to grow their network of connections, where they were recently spotted interaction with one of the League of Villain members, Jin Babagawi, otherwise known as Twice. The screen switched again over to the member of the League of Villains without warning, leaving Izuku sucking in a small trembling breath at the sight of one of his past captors. He didn't notice the worried looks coming from Mirio besides him and Aizawa from the opposite side of the table. This interactions between the two groups has left us to believe they may have begun talks of collaboration together, some kind of mutual agreement." The hero paused, looking down at his papers. "They were weary of being tailed, but with the aid of the police, we were able to confirm an altercation has occurred between the two groups." As the screen switched to the ruins of a building across the room from Izuku, Gran Torino chose that moment to talk up. "The police asked for our assistance, but unfortunately we arrived there too late." The old hero looked across the table to Izuku before sighing. "It's a shame about the situation, but I'm glad to see you out and about, kid, but it seems like things are going to get ugly again." Izuku looked over to his mentor with surprise before giving him a shaky yet determined stare. "It doesn't matter, I still want to help." Well, only if he didn't have to see the League of Villains again. He'd rather stay away from them for the rest of his life, but yet again, he had to something for Eri. Chapter 48? And Quirk erasing bullets. Night Eye nodded with gratitude before asking Bubble Girl to continue. The conversation led to the topic of the Hero Network and the formal plea for help they had posted from heroes across the country. Uraraka, who sat a few seats down along the table, had spoken up to ask about what the Hero Network was for when an agitated Rocklock sighed exasperatedly, drawing the attention in the room. "May I just ask why there are kids here? Even if they are students of UA?" The hero began irritably, frowning as he dropped his head into the palm of his hand, leaning on the table. "If we keep stopping to talk about unnecessary things, we will never get to the end of this." The heroes across the room fell silent at Rocklock's request, Uraraka awkwardly shifting back into her seat as Izuku, unable to see Uraraka's reaction, frowned at the pro hero. It seemed as if, after a short while, Fatgum was the only hero who wanted to stand up for the students, looking as if he was about to retort when another hero across the room interrupted to add his thoughts. I'm going to have to agree with Rock Lock on this one. Night Eye. Izuku looked over to the new voice across the room, only to pause hesitantly as his eyes met with the hero who had been glaring at him before, the same hero who had worked towards capturing and imprisoning him over the course of the last year or so. More specifically, why we're letting one of the students who were kidnapped by All for One and the League of Villains work on a case which involves them. The hero folded his arms as he narrowed his eyes in disapproval, carefully avoiding Izawa's glare as he peered over to Izuku's own as he gave his reasoning. What use is it going to be to anyone when we decide to raid the place and the League sweeps in and kidnaps him again? And although Izuku could hear the hostility in the hero's voice directed at him, Izuku couldn't fault him for his doubts. Some of the heroes around the room narrowed their eyes at the hero's words, while the rest fell into an awkward silence. Izawa and Gran Torino turned to glare at the hero for his blunt and careless words as Izuku furrowed his brows in a grimace. I wouldn't let that happen again, and if I do I'll break myself out, Izuku said anxiously as all eyes in the room fell onto him. The hero scoffed, interrupting Izuku, clearly annoyed as he retorted. Like you did last time? And how did you manage to do that? The hostility coming from across the table left Izuku too shocked for words, his eyes wide with disbelief as the hero hinted at the details of his escape. It was clear from the beginning that the hero didn't like him, but surely they must realize the questions his words would bring? On edge from his words, Izuku didn't notice Izawa's deepening frown, moments away from stepping in himself when Night Eye spoke up first. Enough, that's enough squabbling for today. We're pulling away from the topic of the meeting. His stern voice echoed across the room, glaring at the hero who had dared to ask Izuku those questions. You need to keep your personal grudges out of the meeting, or you will be asked to leave. Sir Night Eye's cryptic threat, to those out of the know, hit a nerve with the hero who wisely decided to stay quiet, sitting back into his chair with folded arms. As the room settled, Night Eye cleared his throat. Continuing on, last week an investigation of what we believe is a compound linked to the Yakuza group was conducted. Bubblegirl and I were recording the activity entering and leaving the facility. He continued, leaning his head onto his connected hands under his chin. During that time, while patrolling, my interns Tagata and Midoriya happened to run into their leader himself, along with the young girl who identified herself by the name of Eri. Mirio sighed deeply beside Izuku, lowering his head at the memories of the condition she had been in. When she first ran into us, she had been covered in bandages. She looked terrified. A few gasps could be heard around the room as the state of the child was revealed, Izuku nodding solemnly in agreement to his upperclassman's words. Night Eye looked over to his interns before facing the rest of the group. When investigations of the girl were conducted, we, unfortunately, were not able to gather any more information on the girl. Eri, as far as we have found, does not legally exist. The heroes shifted uncomfortably at the horrible situation Night Eye's words had shared, a few gasps filtering through the room as Izuku's internship mentor concluded his point. There was a child trapped and no one had known. With that in mind, we've reason to believe that the Shihase case's main source of income is from weaponized drugs. Night Eye pushed forward, the screen behind him finally switching to something new as he looked towards Fatgum. That is why I've asked Fatgum and his interns to join us today, who also happens to have experience with this weaponized drug firsthand. Rock Lock lifted his head of his hand, having given up pestering on Izuku's presence, as he looked over to Fatgum with interest. So what kind of drug was it then? Some kind of trigger? Fatgum rubbed the back of his head. That was what the first villain Kirishima here went against was using, but afterwards, Amajiki here went against quite the opposite. Fatgum began as a serious frown formed on his face, looking over to his two interns beside him. One of the villains had a gun with bullets that, when shot with, were able to destroy someone's quirk. The hero looked down at Amajiki, gently pressing his hand atop his head as he encouraged the socially anxious boy to speak, as Izuku and the rest of the unsuspecting people around the table looked around in shock. Amajiki, as comical as it looked, dropped his head with an embarrassed sigh. It took away my ability to use my quirk at all, but thankfully the effects wore off overnight. Amajiki began with a mumble, not giving anyone around the table eye contact, as he activated a few small squid tentacles on his fingers. I can use my quirk fine now. But it was rather off-putting for a while. A bullet which could stop quirks. Night Eye nodded his head, looking over to Izawa. We've brought Eraserhead in to explain in further detail. Izawa looked around the room dully. Unfortunately, from what I can see, this drug works differently to how my quirk does. Aizawa began, folding his arms. My quirk disables someone's quirk factor temporarily without damaging it. This drug, however, seems to target the quirk factor directly, damaging it enough to force it to stop working until it heals like a regular wound. A drug that could damage quirk factors? The conversation carried on without Izuku, as Night Eye continued on as Izuku was stuck in his thoughts. Caught up in his own problems and emotions, he couldn't get the possibilities out of his head. And with the bullet Kirishima saved, we did some further testing. Could that drug get rid of his quirk? The dreaded hunger he feared to feel again? If he just preserve one for all he could. Contains traces of human DNA. All the thoughts and possibilities vanished as they came, deep inner horror surfacing at Fatgum's words as Izuku was pulled from his thoughts, eyes sunken and hollow. Human DNA? In the drug? Why would there be DNA in the drug unless the villain is so desperate to keep the kid with him? The bloody scent that had drifted through Erie's bandages. Was Overhaul using her body? Was it Erie's DNA? The realization washed over Izuku, slowly clamping his hand over his mouth in unnoticed horror as he discovered the true meaning behind what Night Eye was hinting at. Disgust raged as something other than normal food made Izuku sick to his stomach. Oh no. So is there actually any evidence between these bullets Fatgum's agency has found at this Overhaul guy, the oblivious hero who had verbally attacked Izuku early pestered? It seems awfully like you're trying to push this on them without any concrete evidence. Centipede took control. We have evidence which shows that some of the suppliers of Tigger have recently come into contact with the Shiha Sekai, Night Eye's sidekick began, clicking the screen forward to a trade map which the drugs followed. Rikayo and her team have also recently come into contact with some quirk enhances, which have followed through the same supply chain. All the drugs in concern here have come from the same supply chain the Shiha Sekai are part of, in one way or another. We're not sure if they are selling these bullets or mass-producing them, but we're almost certain that they are giving away samples in an attempt to gather more allies. Night Eye took over, Centipede allowing him to continue freely. In addition to that, Overhaul's quirk gives him abilities to break down matter. He also claimed that Eri was his daughter. Whether they are related or not, it's not too far-fetched to believe that he may have someone under him with similar abilities. Izuku felt his heart break for the poor girl, as his suspicions were confirmed as true. The Shiha Sekai were experimenting on her? A morbid silence deafened the room, as each and every person was left horrified by the inhuman acts Chisaki was conducting. Damn it, this would have been far easier if these two kids of yours Night Eye had grabbed her in the first place. Rocklock uttered out a curse, as Izuku and Mirio felt a wave of guilt overcome them. Night Eye lowered his head as he looked over to the hero. I apologize, I'll take responsibility. I instructed neither of them to engage the enemy, and they choose to follow through with my orders. Rocklock sighed exasperatedly as he accepted Night Eye's response. So how are we going to find this girl now? Across the table, Rikayo agreed, folding her arms as she peered at Night Eye with curiosity. I'm afraid I'm going to have to agree with Rocklock's question. How do you intend to find her now? Night Eye pushed his glasses up as he addressed their question. Over the last few months of our investigation, we have located a number of different facilities linked to the Shiha Sekai. In addition to that, I was able to use my quirk on a member who works in the compound we believe Eri is currently being held at, only a few miles from where my interns last saw her. We've seen that the compound goes far underground, and we've learned the route into the basement. However, I'm unsure of the extent the facility may go. How are we meant to find a child in a maze underground? We can't afford to spend time looking around each room for her. Rocklock countered, your quirk may have seen what she was, but that doesn't mean she's going to be there when we go to rescue her. Chisaki saw her with heroes once before, he definitely isn't going to let her walk out so freely again. I agree, which is why I ask all of you here to keep an eye out on any possible movement at the compounds we've found across the country. Night Eye agreed, sitting back up as he unclasped his hands. My quirk will give us the insight we need into the facility once used on someone working there, and once we have narrowed down her location, we have other means of pinpointing exactly where she is. Night Eye looked over to Izuku meaningly as he paused, causing the poor boy to tense up in anticipation. Midoriya, having met the child himself, will be able to find Eri and Overhaul if necessary. Looks of surprise hovered around Izuku as the heroes in the room placed their trust in Night Eye's decision, only Aizawa himself peering over to Night Eye in contemplation, not liking the connotations of where the conversation was headed. With that in mind, we need to keep an eye on any changes which happen around the noted facilities. Once we've ensured her location, it won't take long to find her. Night Eye began determinedly. We will rescue Eri and force these bullets out of production. Once the meeting was over, Izuku and the rest of the UA students went to one of the many empty rooms in the agency as the heroes finished up discussing the building they would each have to watch. Izuku sat with his hands clenched into fists, silently worrying with a grimace, hurting his face, as the rest of the students obviously discussed the meeting, the internalized struggles Izuku was facing standing silent. He honestly wasn't sure how to feel about it. Night Eye was placing the whole operation's success to find her on his quirk. A quirk that, even though he wanted to improve and utilized it to the best of his abilities, still horrified him and left him feeling grossly uncomfortable after having it brought up in such a public situation, however underlying the hints were. After Night Eye had mentioned using Midoriya's quirk to save Eri, the questions about Night Eye's own quirk came rolling into the conversation. Odd heroes from left and right of the room asked why he wouldn't use their own futures to see if the rescue mission was successful. Night Eye had refused through and through, and in some ways, it seemed rather hypocritical to Izuku. Putting Izuku in a position where he had to use his Ghoul quirk, no matter how unharmful that one ability was compared to the rest. Only to refuse to use his own quirk to see the outcome of the rescue operation. Although in hindsight Izuku understood Night Eye's reasoning, knowing that all of his foresighted predictions so far had come true, only for the man to look into All Might's eyes to see his death in the near future. Yeah, that was something that even Izuku didn't think he could stomach seeing. Limiting the use of his own quirk for the protection of others around him was the excuse that Night Eye had finally come up with, not far from the truth, but lacking any details that someone would need to put two and two together. Unluckily for Izuku, with the conversation he had with All Might the other week, it didn't take long to see how the vision was affecting Night Eye too. Izuku let out a shaky sigh, slowly coming to terms with the rescue plan, as the elevator door on the other side of the room opened with a ping. Izuku and the others peered up to look at the new presence in the room, only to make eye contact with his own class sensei as Izawa made his way across the room. Uraraka, who had been busily talking to the rest of the people around the table, was the first to speak. "Izawa-sensei. What are you doing here?" she said with a hint of surprise in her voice. The tired hero sighed as he scratched the back of his head at Uraraka's choice of greeting. "I just came up here to tell you all we need to be getting back to the UA campus soon. And please, Uraraka, call me Eraserhead outside of school." Uraraka quickly apologized as the hero looked over to where Izuku was wearily seated before addressing his students dully. "I'll be honest with you all. Before Night Eye announced he was planning on using Midoriya's quirk to save Eri, I'd been planning on pulling you all out of your internships." A row of gasps could be heard as Izuku and his classmates looked up at their sensei with shock and surprise, Isaacus's own eyes blown white as his jaw dropped in mild horror. Uraraka bounced up out of her seat as she leaned toward her teacher in dismay. "What? But why?" Izawa gave his students a tired sigh, rubbing his eyes in the process. "You heard what they said in the meeting, didn't you?" Izawa began, lowering his hand as looked at his students with concern. "The League of Villains is involved now, and you've all been through enough unfortunate situations for me to comfortably allow you to be so again." Izuku watched as Izawa looked over at him with hidden worry in his eyes. "Especially for you, Midoriya. I don't want to put you through that or let you near them again in good conscience. It's not fair on you or your sense of well-being." The look of concern and worry on Izawa's face made Izuku lower his head in shame and embarrassment, the room falling silent as he clamped his eyes shut for a moment and breathed a deep sigh of acceptance. "And no, it's fine, I want to help save Eri." Somehow, it looked as if the worry got worse. "I know I can trust you, Midoriya, I know you are more than capable on your own. It seems as if even Night Eye would agree with me on that, but if they ever go after you again, I need you to run away. Get out as fast and quickly as you can." Izawa told him seriously, looking down at this student in a way that gave Izuku little options in arguing. Izuku grimaced at Izawa in shock and horror at the request, his mind now fully pulled away from the idea of the quirk-canceling drug. The rest of the group looked between the two with worry and shock, unsure of what to say. What? No. What about Eri?" Izuku's fists remained clenched, watching as Izawa walked towards him to place a comforting hand on his shoulder. The expression on Izawa's face softened. "There will be plenty of other heroes who will be there to rescue her, there's no chance of her getting left behind, but if push comes to shove, you need to stay away from the League." We don't know what their intentions still are for you, alright? A grimace fell onto the hero's face, hesitating for only a moment. I know you managed to escape last time, Midoriya, but there is no chance it would be as easy again. Do you understand? As much as he hated to admit it, Izuku nodded his head, understanding where his sensei was coming from. Yes, sir. With that, Aizawa looked up and back around at the rest of his students seated around the table, looking all as equally worried as each other. That goes for the rest of you as well, Aizawa continued, addressing the rest of his students sincerely. You're still students, you still have your whole lives in front of you, so don't go in there believing you are expected to risk life and limb to rescue her. The rest of the students watched Aizawa in subtle surprise, slowly lowering themselves back into their seats as their sensei lowered his voice as he spoke. There will always be other opportunities to rescue her, but you won't get another chance of being a hero. The hidden connotations behind Aizawa's words spoke loudly enough. There were no second chances for life. Aizawa was right. Izuku had been incredibly lucky escaping, with Bakugo in tow, from the clutches of the League of Villains the first time. He knew they would never let him escape so easily again. Aizawa let out a deep breath as he hummed in thought, slowly letting go of Izuku's shoulder as he stood up again. That being said, I know I won't be able to stop you all once you've started something. You're strong, all of you, and you've been through a lot together. Their sensei began, looking at them all with a tired smile warming his face. More so for you too, Midoriya, so if you all want to go through with this, I'll be there and I'll help you in any way I can. Surprise popped up onto his students' faces as Aizawa lowered his head into his capture scarf, Izuku himself looking towards his sensei with comfort. Aizawa really did have a soft side, Izuku knew from experience, but this was probably the first time he'd seen it when he wasn't alone after crying about his own problems. We'll be there to help you too, Deku. We'll all be there to help rescue her. Uraraka pipped in, clenching her fist with determination as Hato quickly agreed, both their cheerful personalities warming the sorrow in the room. Aizawa looked between his students before continuing softly. I'll only say this once to you, just to give you even a little peace of mind. Aizawa began, just because you didn't save her before doesn't mean you didn't give her hope. Before you met her, no one had even known of her existence, but now we have ways of tracking her down until she is safe. These things take time, Midoriya, but we heroes will always be there to save those in need. Izuku knew from experience his sensei's words were not just for show. He looked over to his friends as a small, wobbly smile replaced the grim look on his face as he rubbed away the tears which had once threatened to form, his sensei's words warming his heart. Yes, sir. We'll try our best. So, what are your thoughts on the boy? The room was quiet, shaded by the sun falling on the opposite side of the building as the pair of heroes stared off into the distance around the agency. Gran Torino stood beside Night Eye's side, looking over at the tall hero as Night Eye stood silent in thought. I was skeptical at first, but he's far different than I first imagined. Night Eye slowly began, contemplating his words before he continued. I didn't understand why he was given the freedom he has after the heinous crimes he committed, having to blindly trust his sensei's words. But after meeting him I understand. Gran Torino hummed in acknowledgement. I wasn't too different when I found out myself, although I had met him before his past was revealed, it was still a lot to take in. Gran Torino replied, admittedly, it didn't take too much convincing, after all the interrogations and alibis, proving he wasn't working with the League. The shock has worn off, but I'm still coming to terms with it myself, God knows I'm not the only one. Night Eye remained silent, deep in thought, wondering how All Might had come to terms with it himself, as Gran Torino huffed out a small chuckle. Still, I feel like now it's out in the open, he's doing much better now. At least now I know the teenage angst I thought he was putting on during his internship has mostly gone, that must be one massive weight off his shoulders. Gran Torino's weak attempt of lightening the conversation had Night Eye resisting the urge to roll his eyes, now really wasn't the time or topic. Ignoring the older hero's words, Night Eye looked toward Gran Torino with an unimpressed look, raising an eyebrow. It was a bit of a gamble, wasn't it? Sending Midoriya my way with the powers he holds. Gran Torino let out a chuffed laugh, ignoring Night Eye's attempt of changing the topic as he shook his head. At least it seems as if it's paying off, especially if it gives you and All Might a chance to talk. Night Eye glared at the older hero as he sighed irritatedly in response. You shouldn't be going around playing games like that, Torino. Night Eye began unamusingly, eyeing the hero before pausing. But now I understand why you recommended him to me. Their backstories may vary dramatically, but now I can see why All Might chose him." Gran Torino looked away from the city landscape as he smiled fondly at the hero, his thoughts wandering to their shared student. "It seems as if your quirk can't predict everything perfectly after all." Night Eye gave in and rolled his eyes at the agitating older man. "Maybe this time, but I wouldn't push it." Chapter 49. Akuma no Ko. In the days after the meeting, Izuku and his friends were on standby until the go-ahead for the mission was called. The heroes from that day had all been scouting around, monitoring Overhaul's movements until they were able to confirm Eri's location. Each day that passed, Izuku was feeling the pressure and nerves slowly getting to him. It felt different to the normal feelings of doom and gloom he had become so adjusted to over the last year or so, and these new feelings left him uneasy and sick. It didn't help that he, along with the rest of his classmates and senpais, had been prohibited from discussing the case, left with his thoughts mulling in his head. Thankfully, the few classmates who'd been at the meeting had also agreed to assist in the raid, leaving Izuku feeling much better and slightly worse at the same time. There were so many things which could go wrong, using his quirks in a real combat situation, where he could be forced into using both of them to save another life. Izuku grimaced, the possibility becoming far too real from the theory Night Eye had given him. If he was honest, he was far more worried about the consequences of his actions than anything else. Far too many people were waiting for him to slip up, and Izuku didn't need to be told to see it in the eyes of the antagonistic hero who was on his case, let alone meeting with the rest of them. Although if it really came down to it, Izuku was sure he would be able to put aside his own hesitance and disgust with his powers to save someone's life. Damn the consequences, that was a problem for his future self that he wouldn't allow his thoughts to linger on. The only other problem Izuku had been lingering on was the chance that Kirishima, Asui and his senpais would find out too. He was so thankful that Uraraka, who already knew, would be coming along for the raid too, including Izawa and a few others who knew as well. Izuku had no idea how the rest would react. Deep down, that would always worry him. The more people who knew, the more likely it was to become public knowledge, and that was something Izuku knew he couldn't afford. Mentally or physically. While Night Eye had practically encouraged using it to save people, and Izawa had seemingly had no problem using his tracking abilities for the raid, he knew there was a reason the heroes, in general, were so desperate to keep his secret. It was difficult to find the balance. Izuku let out a tired sigh from where he was sitting in the staff room, slowly eating away at his lunch. He didn't notice when his friend walked into the office to join him, too lost in his own thoughts as he stared obliviously at his food. Achako looked over to her friends as she walked over to him, pausing slightly in her step as she looked oddly at the blank expressions written over Izuku's face. It wasn't often that Midoriya didn't notice people walking into the same room as him. With a worried frown on her face, Uraraka called out to him as she continued walking toward her friend. "Deku? Are you alright?" Izuku jumped at the unexpected voice, blinking back at the sudden appearance of his friend as he looked over at her with surprise. Oh. No, I'm fine. Just lost in thought." Achako watched Izuku with concern as her friend slowly trailed off again, slowly taking a seat next to Izuku as she noticed how lost in thought her friend was as his mind trailed off again. Slowly, Uraraka placed a comforting hand on Izuku's shoulder, leaning forward with meaningful concern as he looked at her from the sudden unexpected contact. "Deku? Are you sure?" The two looked at each other in silence as Izuku slowly flushed in color from looking at Achako's eyes before quickly looking away, clasping his hands as he pulled them in closer away from his food. Why did she always manage to get such a good read on him? Izuku hesitated for a moment before confessing with a sigh. "I'm worried about the raid." Izuku began quietly, Achako leaning in closer towards him from her seat as she tried to get a better hearing of what he was saying. "What Night Eye said in the meeting left me with a lot to think about." Uraraka's expression softened as she understood where he was coming from before looking back up at him worriedly. "I know you don't want to, but you can always back out if it becomes too much for you. You know that, right, Deku?" Izuku quickly nodded his head, dismissing the idea. "No, that's not what I want. I can't do that to her." Izuku reached his hands up and rubbed the side of his temple, subconsciously leaning in closer to Uraraka's hand as he slumped in the chair. "I can't leave her knowing that they're experimenting on her. That they are using her to make the bullets." Uraraka could feel the way Izuku tensed under her hand as he trailed off, the bullets in question, undoubtedly the quirk erasing ones that had been floating around in her own mind as well. The silence trickled on. Deku, if those bullets cause you to react to them in any way similar to how Sensei's quirk does, you need to avoid them. The pain they will cause you will be worse than what they will do to the rest of us. Uraraka paused and looked at her friend before taking a deep breath, her voice calming down. I know you wouldn't risk the operation to save Eri, but please don't try or think about it. It won't do you any good to linger on it. Izuku lowered his head in shame as she caught onto his trail of thoughts, Uraraka taking the moment to move her hand around his shoulders as she brought him into a small hug before letting go to look him in the eyes. Those bullets seem to only temporarily erase quirks, and Sensei said himself that they damage the victim's quirk factors as they go. She began, Izuku looking back up at his friend with a grim yet disgruntled expression. They aren't something we should take lightly or mess around with, even if it does create some kind of short-term solution to your situation. Izuku gazed at his friend, slowly nodding as he understood where she was coming from, taking a deep calming breath as he rubbed the exhaustion growing from his eyes. Yay, I know. Don't worry. Izuku began tiredly, offering his friend a weak smile as he tried to convince her he was okay. I knew it was a bad idea from the start, every second in the raid is going to count. Right? I just couldn't help myself wondering about the idea of getting rid of this damn quirk even for a day. Izuku paused, his smile faltering as he looked away from Achako, missing the way her face winced with sympathy. There was also one for all to think about too. He couldn't afford to get hit by a bullet and lose that quirk too, even for a short amount of time during the raid. He would need it to prevent himself from becoming a burden. Sat beside him, Achako felt her heart hurt with something she couldn't entirely explain. The pain of watching her friend admit he knew there was no way of removing what caused him so much trauma, watching as he gave into the reality and exhaustion that they were left with. With a soft tug, Achako brought her friend yet again into another deep, meaningful hug. The first one they had shared since the night in his dorm. Hey, she began softly, allowing him to melt into the comfort of her arms. Even if we don't know how to solve your problem now, it doesn't mean we won't someday, Deku. If there was something she could do to help her friend, even with the impossibilities which surrounded his situation, it was to give him hope, just as he had done for Eri. There's gotta be a way, somewhere in this world, and I'll help you find it. The wait seemed to take too long for the information to come though about the go-ahead for the raid, the message reaching them all early into the morning. Across the country, heroes from different backgrounds with different abilities all prepared for the team-up before trying the distance to the meeting point before the raid. The UA students, accompanied by Eraserhead, left the school premises early in the morning as they made their way to the site. Midoriya, while we have evidence that Eri was in a specific location, I need to request that you tell me if you can still detect her from within the building before the raid starts, is that understood? It had only taken a couple of minutes after Izuku had arrived before he was dragged away, Night-Eye making a few last-minute requests before the operation was to begin. Of course, sir. Izuku replied. The conversations between them had quickly parted almost as soon as they had begun, Night-Eye wasting no time briefing the heroes on the plans he had come up with, aiming to make the raid flow as smoothly as possible. It seemed as if the hero agency collaborating on the attack hadn't left any resources to go to waste either. Warrants, the police and extra emergency details had all been prepared. It was only a matter of time until Eri would be in the hands of the heroes, and with everything in place, the only thing left to do was rescue her. Heroes and police lined themselves up outside of the building, the air tense but unsettlingly calm, as the warrant was ready to be presented to the organization hidden behind the compound doors. That's when Izuku, frozen in motion looking towards the entrance, felt the vibrations coming towards them. Vibrations? The gates to the compound exploded into fragments raining down around them as a villain the size of an elephant charged through, bashing the police officers and heroes who happened to be in the way, into the air. The police officer who had been close to Izuku flew, as the young hero quickly reacted to leap into the air and grab him safely within his arms before placing him on the ground. His friends and a few others doing the same as Ryukyu quickly switched into her dragon form to retaliate it against a villain. In a matter of seconds the temporary serenity was disturbed into an active battlefield. Everyone? Into the building. Don't forget the details we went over before. Night-Eye commanded loudly over the top of the rattling battle noise. The scattered heroes and police from the unexpected attack work drew their attention back to the building as they wasted no time getting into formation, preparing to charge into the building all at once. Izuku's head spun around to the few still occupied by the monstrous villain outside of the compound catching the eye of Ryukyu, who called out over the riot. "Don't worry about these guys out here. Ryukyu agency will stay out here to deal with these guys. We will follow you guys to provide backup later." With the front entrance covered, Izuku steeled himself with a sharp nod of the head, sprinting over to where Night Eye was standing near the entrance. "Come on. Let's go." Together, they all ran in, Izuku, Night Eye and a few others taking up the helm as they charged in, leaving Uraraka and Asui in the distance behind them. A few of the villains who had been just inside of the building were taken on by some of the police officers, leaving the rest of them to push on forward. Sprinting down the corridor, following the path that Night Eye had seen in his vision, the four-sided hero looked down at his intern as they ran, calling out towards him. "Midoriya, can you detect her?" At his short unsaid request, Izuku closed his eyes as he continued running, attuning his senses into the smells around him as he trusted the heroes besides him. The stagnant air filled his lungs, faint traces of the girl lingering off into the distance. Traces of the blood and overhaul far more pungent in the air. Izuku narrowed his eyes as they opened, staring dead ahead as he began running faster, confirming her presence to the heroes. "It's faint, but she's here, I can smell her." Night Eye only nodded in return as he pushed himself faster forward, the rest of the group following closely behind him. Twists and turns down the corridor lead them to a spot where Night Eye suddenly stopped running, Izuku sliding to a stop as he noticed a lingering whiff of mixed people surrounding the area. As Night Eye moved the potted plant, Izuku felt his eyes widen with realization as the tiles began to move like buttons. They had reached the hidden door. As the door suddenly popped open, Izuku felt his senses kick in at the sudden strong whiff and movement of people running towards them, reacting to the three villains that had been hidden behind out of view. With a dash, Izuku was out of the way of a villain charging towards him with a knife, even if it wouldn't have harmed him. His human instinct screamed at him to run away as he gave space for some of the more experienced heroes to tackle the thugs before him. With a quick thud, Izuku barely had a chance to blink before two of them were partially restrained as a couple of officers tackled the last one. "Quickly! Into the tunnel!" Night Eye yelled out, grabbing their attention as they pursued further into the maze. Izuku and the rest of the heroes charged down the stairs, not meeting anyone as they ran, only the suddenly stronger smell of their target girl, confirming that Night Eye's visions had been right. "She's definitely this way, sir. It's been getting stronger ever since the door opened." "Good." Night Eye quickly responded, not bothering to look at his intern when suddenly then came across a concrete wall blocking the path. The heroes skidded to a stop as they looked ludicrously at the blockage in front of them, Izuku's eyes widening with disbelief at the sight. Air's smell had been in this direction, it still was. "Well, what the hell are we supposed to do now?" Rock Lock, who had been trailing along behind them, called out with annoyance, looking just as peeved and stumped as some of the other heroes filling the corridor. Shocked but calm, Mirio took a step forward, walking in front of the crowd. "Don't worry, I'll go and check what's on the other side," he began, stepping forward as he walked quickly up to the wall. Midoriya, knowing how Mirio's quirk works, watched in mild horror as he saw the boy walk through the wall, half expecting his clothes to fall off. It seemed as if Kirishima had been following the same thought pattern as him as he called out to their senpai. "Don't worry," Night Eye stated as calmly as could be, waiting for Mirio to return through the wall. His hero costume is specially designed with his own hair to follow in wherever he goes. There wasn't a chance to reply as Mirio's head and body materialized back through the wall, his face firm with serious intent. The corridor continues past his wall. Someone's put it up as a deterrent. The heroes blinked with relief as their eager determination returned, quickly falling into battle position as they prepared to break down the wall, only for Izuku and Kirishima to charge forward full thrust, smashing the wall into tiny bits before the pros could get there. With each step Izuku took, he felt his determination swirl like a storm, ready to explode as they pursued forward. The scent of Eri was getting stronger, mixing with the other worryingly nice smells lingering around the facility. There were lots of deaths here, he could almost taste it, lots of blood. Izuku scrunched his eyes up as he tried to disperse the thought from his mind, catching the attention of his homeroom sensei as they ran. "Midoriya, what's wrong?" Izuku snapped his eyes open with unease, looking at his sensei with concealed concern written on the older man's face. We need to be careful," Izuku huffed out, dismissing his sensei's concern as he pursued on, furrowing his brows, "there's a lot of blood about." Izuku didn't see Izawa's eyes marginally widen with understanding as the hero pushed on faster, Night Eye undoubtedly overhearing their conversation as well, the unsaid words hidden between the lines not going unnoticed. They needed to be careful. The heroes and police rounded yet another corner, seemingly following an infinite trail of tunnels, when suddenly the walls and flooring around them all began to shift and move. Whoa! What the hell? As soon as the walls and floors began to move, running down the corridor became almost impossible for the heroes. I know whose quirk this is, but this shouldn't be possible. Rock Lock called out among the crowd, bumping into Fatgum, who was quick to respond. You've gotta remember who we're dealing with here, they probably took a quirk-enhancing drug. Rock Lock cursed, bumping into Eraserhead as he did so before trying and failing to straighten himself out. We need to find a way to stop this quirk, there's no way we can continue like this. Izawa grunted in agreement, searching across the walls for some semblance of a person to quirk erase. I can't find anyone to lock onto. He swore with agitation, looking frantically around the corridor. We need to get them out the walls. He awkwardly tried to turn around, head twisting as he did so, as he came up with the idea to ask his student for help locating the possible villain. Midoriya, can you? Izawa paused. Izuku was standing tall, the wobbly flooring doing practically nothing to stop him. Eyes widened with shock, watching in astonishment, Izawa called out to his student again, catching the other hero's attention too. Midoriya, how are you doing that? Izuku slowly turned to face his sensei, still unsure of his own balance as he looked behind him, surprise riddled with confused hesitation clear on his expression, not knowing what to reply with. How on earth was he doing that? It wasn't like he'd been in this kind of situation before. Ghouls were known to have advanced balance and agility, but this was to the extremes. Was this part of his ghoul quirk? An ability he'd not realized had existed? The other heroes and all began to look towards Izuku in shared shock, watching as he shifted on his feet to find some semblance of an answer to the skill he was currently manifesting. I can keep my balance. Izuku exclaimed the obvious in a state of dumbfounded shock. Izawa's jaw fell for a moment before quickly snapping shut as he concentrated on the ground again, struggling to keep his balance as he watched his student able to counter the waves in the wall with his abilities. He'd known about the ghoul abilities, having seen it only so many times before in the past, but this was completely unexpected. The look of shock was shared with his student, as Izuku looked just as surprised as he. Izuku peered around the corridor, noticing how he was the only one able to stand as pulled himself together, his expression falling into another one of determination. Why did that look on his student's faces always cause Izawa to feel so much dread and exhaustion? Izuku cautiously eyed his sensei, desperately wanting to take advantage of his situation as he slowly started to edge away from the group. Eri was still in danger and he couldn't waste any more time. He needed to save her. He had to find her. Midoriya, what are you doing? I can smell her blood, I know where she is. Isuka's abrupt response came as a surprise as Izawa watched helplessly, still stumbling and failing to catch his balance as his student began to slowly edge away, searching for an answer to keep him from running. You need to wait for backup or until we can figure out how to stop this. Izawa called across sternly, gesturing to the irritating condition on the floor, his eyes narrowing seriously as he instructed his student, we can't afford for you to charge in. Izuku winced at his sensei's tone of voice, looking at him with an expression of desperation as he quickly made up his mind. I'll find the guy causing this problem and stop him. Izuku began, determination filling his soul as he clenched his fist angrily. We don't have the time to waste. We need to find Eri as quickly as possible, and this is only going to slow us down. Izawa cursed, filled with worry and unease, as Izuku disappeared down the corridor. Midoriya. Izuku knew in his heart what was right to do. He hated to ignore his teachers, but Izuku wasn't stupid enough to not realize the potential dangers that this ground-moving quirk had made for them. With each second that passed, Eri was getting further and further out of their reach. On the other hand, Izawa's sensei was right, it would be another few minutes before the drugged quirk controlling the floor wore off. He needed to rely on the rest of the heroes. Izuku knew if he found Eri before then, he wouldn't be able to hold off Overhaul on his own. Izuku looked back over his shoulder at the group of heroes behind him, his body absorbing the shock of each wave with a bounce as he sprung down the corridor. Green sparks scattered around him like thunder and lightning as the storm seemingly controlling the floor got worse and worse, catching himself as he narrowly dodged another wave of concrete. Sounds of grinding concrete creaked through the air, dust falling from the ceiling as he pursued forward, the vibrations in the ground knocking around his senses. Izuku was sure his balance had never been this good before, jumping over yet another attack directed towards him. He tripped and stumbled, his hand grazing the floor as he pushed himself up and forward, cursing as he went. The smell of blood only got stronger and stronger, mixing and morphing into something grotesquely pleasant. Izuku narrowed his eyes angrily, swinging around a corner as he vanished from the hero's view, tracking the villain down in the walls like a rat. He was nearby, Izuku was sure of it, and it seemed as if the villain had noticed him too. The creaking in the walls took a violent turn as a wave on concrete threatening to drown him alive appeared abruptly before him, causing Izuku to slide to a stop as he rolled out of the way, narrowing avoiding a concussion from the wall. His head shot back up, but before he even had a chance to retaliate, another came crashing down upon him, the power of one for all holding it at bay as he forced his way through. The floor was quickly turning impossible for even him to crawl across. Izuku stumbled and fell, left vulnerable on the floor as another deadly tsunami threatened to crush him, barely able to protect himself as he punched his way through again. His labored breath began to force him to breathe through his mouth, making it almost impossible to locate where the villain was as he staggered to stand up. He wasn't given a chance to recuperate. Adrenaline ran cold and survival instincts began to scream painfully in his mind, his body working on it his own as it saved him from a horrific death, Izuku's mind only able to work so fast as he desperately tried to comprehend what was happening around him to make his next move. Everything had gone downhill so quickly. The walls closing in to crush him, the ceiling crumbling as the sensory overload thumped heavily in his head. He needed to save Eri. He didn't feel the power of his Kagyun activating purely out of the fear which had filled his soul, body and mind. His will alone forced his body to fight the petrifying fear he felt as tentacle after tentacle made itself known after months hidden in the dark. Blood-red, wiry veins ran up and down like vines strangling its prey. The darkness it surrounded was as strong as steel as it broke the concrete into dust, clawing itself into the walls like an infectious disease. Each fragment countering the waves perfectly as they dug into each side of the corridor, lifting Izuku out of harm's way as he gathered his bearings. What the hell was going on? Izuku looked around him in awe, his Kagyun seemingly working on its own as it saved him from imminent death, taking back control as he used them to fly through the maze of tunnels. It had never been his intention, his Kagyun criminally abstained from using the one tool which would link him back to his crimes, but this? He knew what was right in his heart. Power flew down his veins, Izuku feeling as light as a feather as the suspension in his Kagyun allowed him to smoothly hunt for the man responsible. His arms accepted the breeze from the stale air as he watched his Kagyun work in a way he'd never felt. For the first time in a long time, Izuku was glad that someone had seen the potential in both his quirks. His own words and Night Eyes reminiscing in the back of his mind as his mentor proved him wrong. He was using his quirks to save someone. Eyes wide, exhilaration and resolve buzzing furiously through his body with no eyes to watch him. Izuku felt free. The potential reeling under his skin and extended body flourished with excitement, the strength and skill flowed smoothly like silk, Izuku not throwing away a second of time as he hunted the walls. And he was enjoying it. His hidden power felt new, and Izuku felt unstoppable. A voice reeled silently in the back of his mind. "Go on, Izuku-kun, go and find them." As the haunting voice replayed on loop silently in the back of his mind, the anger Izuku felt towards the criminals who had coerced and forced Eri into unspeakable things, his hatred for human experimentation flowing through his body as he became embodiment of rage. As he rounded his final corner, Izuku gritted his teeth furiously as he slammed his Kagyun through the wall, the villain responsible for their surroundings forced onto the floor as the movement around them stuttered to a stop. The villain turned to retaliate with a fearsome brute, only to gaze into the heterochromic eyes which bore down on him as horror replaced recognition. It seemed as if the villains weren't prepared to see him here. Izuku gave a rare feral grin as he forced the villain into a restraining position, pressing heavily on their back as his Kagyun dissipated from the air, his eyes still red with contempt as a constant reminder of who he really was. The sound of the hero's footsteps charging towards him grew louder and louder as he yelled out to his comrades. "I've caught him." Chapter 50. The Tsunami Walls. "I've caught him." Izawa heaved a sigh of relief as he sprinted around the corner, the others trailing closely behind him as Midoriya came back into view, holding the motionless villain down heavily against the floor, seeming as if his student had knocked him out. Good work, Deku. Night Eye called out towards his intern, running alongside Aizawa as he acknowledged Midoriya's effort. Aizawa's eyes trail away from the villain to the hole visible on the back of his student's costume, the skin beneath clear of any signs of wounds and damage, Night Eye seeming to notice his costume too. Izuku's eye faded back into its original deep green as he pulled his concentration away from the villain, stalling for time as he waited for his backup to assist him with the restraint. Quick! I don't have any way of arresting him. Izuku called out with urgency, the heroes quickly piling towards him as the officers behind began to pull out a set of cuffs. Don't worry. We'll take over. One of the officers towards the front called out, Izuku's grip loosening momentarily as a false sense of security seeped into his body. Izuku's attention had become distracted and the villain had noticed as well. In a split second, Izuku felt the villain rip his arm out of his grip before placing their palm firmly onto the ground as a giant cavity on the floor formed underneath the heroes still charging toward him. Izuku watched in horror as the front team of heroes charging towards him fell through the hole, unable to do a thing to save them as his body froze still. Within a matter of moments the villain beneath him began to slowly sink into the floor as well, knocking Izuku back just to pull his arms away to attack the villain, only to leave a harsh dent in the concrete floor below. His head whipped around as he looked for any sight of the villain, sniffing deeply into the air with a looming panic, only to have lost track of the villain throughout the walls, his lack of concentration now bearing the consequence. Izuku cursed. What had he done? Midoriya? Are you okay? The sounds of his sensei's voice drew into the end of the cavity in the ground, stumbling as he scooted towards it as he peered into the hole with a switch his attention, fear gripping tightly in Izuku's chest as he quickly leant across the edge. Sensei. Are you alright? Izuku shouted frantically into the hole, terrified of what he'd see lying below, only for his panic to slowly subside as he noticed a hero's safely standing on a floor below him. Aizawa and the others brushed the dirt of their clothes as his sensei lifted his hands up to call back out to his student, who was leaning tediously over the edge. We're fine, what happened to the… Aizawa's eyes widened in horror as the words were stolen from his lungs. A sharp attack knocked Izuku forward, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he slipped over the edge, as the villain controlling the walls pushed him in, locking the hole in the ceiling in behind him. Midoriya. Izuku whizzed through the air, barely able to turn himself over as he landed with a stumble from the unexpected push. He grimaced as he stabilized his footing, his sensei and mentor both quick to his side as ensured he was okay, thankful to the gods he was able to think quickly enough not to have used his Kagyun in front of so many witnesses. The hole that had been in the ceiling slammed shut with a loud bang, leaving no escape through the passage they had entered through. Aizawa reached his hand out onto Midoriya's shoulder, expressing his concern as watched the hole in the roof vanish with a frown, the villain now freely wandering the building. Well shit, how are we meant to find our way out now? Rocklock cursed, folding his arms with an exasperated sigh as Midoriya was able to take a look around the room he had fallen into, grimacing at the sight of all the other heroes he had trapped in there with him. Aizawa stayed by Midoriya's side as he straightened himself out, sensing the guilt Izuku felt for quite literally landing them in their situation as he looked down at this student beside him. Stop worrying, Midoriya, Aizawa muttered quietly, under the sound of the other hero cursing among themselves. Just focus on finding Eri, we'll need to find a different route. Night Eye, not too far away from him, nodded in agreement at Aizawa's words, scanning the room himself for a way out. He's right, Midoriya, we haven't got time to waste, we're in unknown territory. Night Eye confirmed, scanning the room himself for a way out, noticing the few doors on the sides of the room. Izuku looked over to his mentor before giving a firm nod, bottling his embarrassment for another time as he shut his eyes and concentrated on a single deep breath, the air far more pungent with something Izuku couldn't quite identify. Eri's smell was newer than it had been before. Izuku's eyes snapped open wide, looking towards his teacher and then the door frantically, and there was someone hiding just behind that door. Sensei. There wasn't enough time to warn him as a loud bang ran through the room, drawing everyone's immediate attention. The heroes all jumped as they fell into their battle position, Izuku himself moving to protect whoever was around him as the doors on the side of the dark and stingy room flew open. Well, look what we have here. A group of 3 villains charged into the room, the doors behind them opening up a pathway filled with the unanticipated stench of sterile chemicals, causing Izuku to scrunch up his sensitive nose. The stench of the chemicals overpowered the smell of the blood that had been wafting around the room, Eris's own smell hidden faintly within it. Shit. "Looks like some heroes have decided to barge into our party," one of the villains began to monologue, brandishing his sword over his shoulder as his accomplices began to stalk closer into the room. Fatgum and some of the other heroes began to prepare for an attack, clenching their fists as they retorted. It didn't take long for the tension in the room to rise, as a few of the police officers who had fallen down the hole drew their guns from their pockets threateningly, one of the villains brandishing their own gun as well, pointing it directly in Aizawa and Midoriya's direction. The air was thick with tension, but thankfully before someone's loose finger could trigger a battle, octopus tentacles sprung to life around them, causing Izuku and a few of the others to jump in shock. "What the?" The villains cursed loudly as their weapons were knocked from their hands, stunned at the sudden force pushing and pulling them around, as Izuku quickly traced the owner of the tentacles back to their original owner, Amajiki. "These guys are trying to hold us back, all of you need to get going," Amajiki announced calmly, deeply concentrating on the villains within his hold as they tried to gather their bearings. One of the villains' hand managed to slip their arm out of his hold, raising a gun into the air, only Amajikus's quick thinking to knock it harshly onto the ground. Izuku watched in surprise at his senpai's abilities, too intrigued to hear Fatgum and Kirishima worriedly asking him if he'd be okay with these villains alone, only for the dark-haired boy to brush off their concerns. The octopus tentacles worked in sync, almost replicating the precision and movement of his own Kagyun, leaving Izuku shocked by their similarities. He didn't immediately notice the rest of the heroes turning to run out the doors the villains had walked through, a hand grabbing a hold of his arm with a sharp tug. "Midoriya. Come on." Izuku was dragged harshly from his thoughts as he was pulled towards the exit, his attention quickly pulled back into the game as he began to try and follow Eri's smell, a look of determination settling on his face. Turn by turn, paths into the maze grew more and more frequent, quickly changing directions as Izuku desperately tried to find her location, leading the pack of heroes closer and closer to their targets. The villain who had escaped Izuku grasped, staying uncomfortably silent. And all the while, with each step they took, the fresh scent of Chisaki grew thicker and thicker. Izuku narrowed his eyebrows, frowning with suspicion. "Deku, have you managed to figure out how far away the target is yet?" Night Eye called from beside him, focusing on the path that laid in front as they ran. "Her smell is getting stronger and stronger," Izuku declared in return, concentrating on the smells around him as they charged onward, "but the lack of ventilation is making it harder to trace, and overhauls are getting stronger too." The heroes understood what he meant without a second word. With another deep breath, Izuku closed his eyes as they came towards yet another turn in their course. His concentration was absorbed too far, set on the Eri, to notice the other villain he had pinned down earlier as they traveled silently and smoothly through the walls, not setting any of Izuku's sense until it was too late. In a matter of seconds, the sounds of heavy breathing and gasping were sliced through, the walls and concrete not turning into waves, but targeted attacks against them. Aizawa-sensei struck straight from the side before anyone had a chance to react. "Sensei." The hole in the wall opened up in an attempt to separate the hero from the rest of the group as it struck Aizawa-sensei forcefully in the side, pushing him towards the tunnel. Aizawa grunted in pain as Fatgum was quick to jump into action, using the force of his body weight to propel him in front of the attack while pushing Aizawa out of the way to safety. No one noticing Kirishima determined attempt to save his sensei until the hole in the wall had sealed behind them and left the corridor silent from the young hero's manly words of conviction and concern. "Kirishima." Izuku yelled aloud with distress, looking around frantically for his friend, only for Night Eye to quickly walk up to his side to briefly explain the situation. "We need to keep going, Deku. Kirishima is with Fatgum. There is no time to be worrying about him now." Izuku quickly looked up to Night Eye with a wince of despair, pushing the toll on his body physically and mentally forward as he slowed his running to a walk as he tried to concentrate on the stenches in the atmosphere. The air was getting thicker and thicker, the others oblivious to the strain Izuku was putting his mind through to save the girl. The hero's smells overwhelming the ones he was meant to trace from within the tight cemented walls that surround them. Overhauls making him feel sick to his stomach. The horrifying strong smell of bleach and cleaning chemicals. Eri's becoming harder and harder to trace. There was a vibration making their way towards him from within the walls. Izuku blinked and flinched to the sight as he recognized the villain charging towards them, eyes full of determination as they came back within attacking distance. Eraserhead. He's back. Izuku shouted above the crowd, alerting the heroes to the new presence coming towards them as they held up their guards for another attack, only for the walls to start to bend again. The waves from within the wall came like a tsunami, knocking the heroes to their knees as walls separated them out into smaller groups, each of them struggling to keep themselves upright. For God's sake, not this again. Rocklock's curse could be heard throughout the corridor as he planted his palm firmly onto the ground, locking the nearby walls around them in place. That should do it, everyone be careful. Rocklock commanded, leading the group forwards past Izuku as they walked over the bumpy ground. Shit. Look out. The heroes swirled around to look behind them at the scream, as the concrete just outside of Rocklock's reach turned into a wall of death charging straight towards them, Izuku powering up one for all as he pushed in front to defend the people with less destructive quirks behind him. It took punch after punch before the villain decided to change tactics and attack Izuku from the side. The rest of the heroes watched in horror as Izuku let out a deafening gasp as the air from his lungs was knocked forcefully from him, the attack locking him into a crushing spot on the side of the wall as they forced him out of the battle equation. Midoriya. Aizawa yelled frantically as he watched his student getting smothered by a thick layer of concrete, he and the other heroes mortified as they stood back trying to figure out a way to save him. The concrete quickly began to swarm over Izuku's body, gritting his teeth as a sharp pain dug into him deeply on all sides, pressing against his body without tearing through his durable skin. Sensei, help. Aizawa looked around the room, desperately trying to find the villain responsible before Izuku would have to resort to using his ghoul quirk again to save his own life. Where the hell was he? How could he see them from within the walls? Unfortunately, he didn't have a chance either, with Izuku forced out of the way. The crushing wall of concrete continued to charge towards the heroes. The sheer power coming from the villain overwhelmed Rocklock's quirk as the waves within the walls continued to flow like the ocean in a storm, knocking the heroes onto the floor. Walls fell down and separated the heroes from each other, locking them into smaller cages with only a single dim light per person. It felt like an hour before the waves slowly weakened back into the sharp edges and corners that made up the corridor, eerily quiet as all the heroes cautiously stood back up before calling out to each other through the walls that separated them. The villain's boost of trigger had finally worn off. Midoriya. Aizawa breathed full of relief as he turned around in his tiny cage to see his student using his original quirk of green lightning and power to break himself free from the walls which had contained him, quickly running up to the student he had been locked alongside with. That villain's gone, I can't trace his smell through the walls. Izuku muttered to himself, his sensei overhearing clearly with an understanding hum. We need to concentrate on regrouping before we can focus on the villains again, Aizawa began calmly, turning his back to Izuku as they covered each other from sudden attacks. We need to find a way out of here. Call from other heroes came ringing muffled through the walls, Rocklock sounding the closest just on the opposite side of one of the walls caging them. With a swift kick, Midoriya broke the wall down between them, only to come face to face with two terrifyingly identical heroes. One, laying face on the ground in a state of unconsciousness, and the other kneeling above the body. There was no way. Izuku felt his body freeze at the sight, in wide-eyed terror, as the smell of someone who sent heat memories down to their core hit his nose. The trauma from his past crawled up in the back of his mind as he remembered each of the villains who had held him at the pits of his despair, kidnapped and locked away to starve. Why the hell was he here? Aizawa didn't notice Izuku's petrifying fear as he walked into the room, eyes narrowing harshly as he glared at the two people, his body on guard as he prepared for an attack. The Rocklock leaning over the body looked over to the two with wide-eyed shock, seemingly surprised at what had happened to him. This girl just came out of nowhere with a knife and managed to cut my cheek. He insisted, seemingly surprised at what had happened to him, reaching up to wipe the blood dripping from a cut on his cheek. The little creep licked the knife, then turned into me. At the hero's words, Aizawa's face crumpled up onto something of disbelief at the fabricated story, his eyes narrowing dangerously. That girl is meant to be in jail, Rocklock, and you should know that. Hey. What? With a flick of his wrist, Aizawa flew into action, grabbing a hold of Rocklock with his arms tightly bound against his side as he used his quirk on the fraudulent hero. In a matter of moments they watched as the hero's body deformed back into the girl Himiko Toga, leaving them both in shock. Aizawa's eyes widened in disbelief at the girl in front of him, utterly sure that no one had been able to get to the girl or convince her to work with the villains again after what she had confessed to them. The villains would have killed her. It was only the shocking reveal that stunned Izuku so much at the miss and match of smells to face that he pulled himself through his terror to yell out to his sensei. Himiko Toga had never been there when he was held hostage. Sensei. That's twice. Aizawa whipped his head around to Izuku, looking at the fear in his eyes as he kept a tight restraint on the girl, only for her to laugh erratically and jump over his sensei's head to free herself from his attack. With a quick dodge to the side, Aizawa was above to avoid getting stabbed violently in the back, missing the knife by mere centimeters. As her knife whizzed past his face, Aizawa reached out and grabbed a hold of the girl's arm, pressing his other into her back as she was forced onto the ground below, the knife clattering away from her hand. In a desperate attempt to gain information from the enemy, Aizawa interrogated her in the most conventional way. Why the hell is the League working with the Yakuza? Unfortunately, Himiko Toga only let out a sly giggle before her body turned to mush below him as he fell through, the sludge covering his scarf and hero clothes head to toe, mirroring the experience he had faced against Dabi at the summer camp a few months ago. Standing up and shaking off the mess, Aizawa cursed to himself. Fuck. That replica of Himiko Toga had been created before she was put into police custody, that much Aizawa was sure of. Back with Izuku, who was still frozen in shock at the sight of the sludge on the ground, his breathing started to grow heavier and heavier as a wave of unrepressed trauma and unchecked emotions quickly came surfacing. The sudden silence in the room drew Aizawa's attention back towards his student as he watched the panic and anxiety quickly grow and ferment within his student. Quickly, Aizawa ran past Rock Lock to his student's side, internally cursing to himself as he tried to calm his student. This was not a safe place for a panic attack. Izuku felt his stomach begin to burn, his heart screaming at him as tears quickly began falling, his hunger nowhere in sight as he felt sick to his stomach with fear and terror. Midoriya. Midoriya. Aizawa repeated as calmly as he could, the desperation in his voice growing more intense by the second as he tried to grab his student's attention. Izuku felt a firm hand place itself on his shoulder as he tried to flinch away from the touch, not realizing it was his sensei, as his voice slowly started to flood back into his head. His eyes were still white as they frantically searched the room, only for Aizawa to block his view as he continued calling his name, the sick feeling slowly dying down into something more queasy as he scrunched up his face at his sensei's voice. Midoriya. You need to calm down. Aizawa repeated firmly, both his hands now on the sides of Izuku's arms, slowly loosening as Izuku came back around. He looked his sensei in the eyes and gave him a shaken yet quick nod of the head as he heard his words, causing Aizawa to breathe a sigh of relief, managing to calm his student down before it had gotten out of hand. Midoriya, Aizawa called again, ensure the boy knew he wouldn't leave him alone. There is no one else here at the moment. Himiko Toga is in jail, but if Twice has joined the Yakuza, you need to hold yourself together for now and remain calm while we try and get you out. Okay? You can break down later, but now it is not safe. Izuku nodded his head again, pulling his arm out of Aizawa's grip as he shakily wiped the tears from his eyes, the sudden rush of fear and adrenaline drastically wearing him out as he held back his panic. Aizawa was right, they needed to get this job done and get out. And it was up to him to find Eri.